In this video, we're going to build our own event and ticketing platform just like Eventbrite without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. There is just so much that I want to cover within this tutorial today, but before I say another word, let's dive in and take a quick look at what we're going to be building. Over in a preview of my application here, I'm currently logged in and I'm on my homepage. And if I was to scroll on down, I'm going to see a list of all of the events within my target location here. And of course, you can choose to update this location if you would like. But when it comes to all of these events and the rest of our application, it goes without saying that the whole experience is going to be fully responsive today. So regardless of what device you view our application on, you're going to have a beautiful end user experience. Now, if I really wanted, I could also refine my search to discover specific events. So if I was to scroll on up to the top of my page, I can open up my search bar here. And what I'll have the ability to do is add a search query into this field. So I'm going to search for events related to design. And I'll once again update my target location to be San Francisco. I'm then going to perform this search. It'll send me through to my search results page. And on this page, you can see we have one event related to design. And if I was to zoom on in my map, I can see exactly where that's going to be hosted. I can also click through to this event and view the full details of it. So if I was to scroll on down, I can see who's hosting it, the date and time, the location, the full details, as well as all of the additional images that were uploaded to it. If I'd like, I can also choose to purchase tickets to this event. So I'm going to click this here and it's going to redirect me through to a checkout experience, which is powered by Stripe. I'm going to choose to make this payment here and it will purchase a ticket on my behalf and add it to my account. Now on the back end of this application, if I was logged in as a host of an event, I can see a long list of all of my events here that I've created. And I also have the ability to not only edit the details of each event, but also open up a dashboard where I can view all of the analytics for that event. So over on this dashboard page, I can see the total revenue I've generated from this event, how many tickets I've sold, and how many page views the actual event has received. I can also scroll down and see a list of all of the people who have purchased tickets for this event, from which I can choose to refine this down by searching for someone by their name. And then I can choose to mark them as attended. And look, another core feature I should quickly just show you is the process of actually creating an event from scratch. So when you're logged in as someone, you can choose to create a brand new event. Then within this page, you can add in all of the details for that event. I'll just move my head out of the way because after you've added in the basic information, you can go ahead and then upload some things like additional images, as well as the full description and determine the price you would like to charge. Now look, this is just a snapshot of all the core user-facing features within our app today. Of course, there's still so much happening behind the scenes that's going to help power the rest of our Eventbrite clone. If you've ever had an app idea or you wanted to build your own startup, I'm sure by this point, you've realized just how complicated it can be to bring your vision to life. You've probably tried to source a technical co-founder, and I mean, look, there's only so much sucking up to developers you can do before you get sick of it. Trust me, I've been down that road before. Or perhaps you've even gotten a quote from a coder, only to find out it's going to cost an absolute fortune for them to build the app. And look, if we're going to be straightforward, none of these scenarios are ideal, which is why Bubble's going to be your new best friend when it comes to building your startup.
Did we just become best friends? Yep!
Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that it allows you to build fully functional applications without having to write a single line of code. I've been using Bubble for years now, and it's by far the most powerful no-code tool available. Not only does Bubble allow you to build your own custom database, but it gives you the ability to design your application from scratch exactly how you want it. Plus, you can also stitch everything together and make it functional using visual workflows. And finally, you can integrate with third-party tools and services to expand the capabilities of your app. Now look, each one of these features would be a standalone no-code product. And so what I love about Bubble is that it includes all of those features in one single tool. In my opinion, Bubble's kind of like the avatar of no-code tools. While some tools are good for mastering particular things, Bubble is the one tool to rule them all. Now look, by this point, I've already said enough. There are so many features that I need to cover within this tutorial today, so let's just grab our Bubble editor and we can get started. Within our tutorial today, the very first thing I wanted to do was not actually cover how we're going to build any user-facing features, but instead I just wanted to take the time to explain how we can set up and configure our own custom database which is going to power the rest of our Eventbrite build today. Now, if you're relatively new to Bubble, the process of creating a database from scratch can seem incredibly overwhelming. Trust me, I've been there before. But thankfully, because Bubble is a no-code tool, they try and make the process as simple as possible. And it's your boy's job here today to make things as easy as possible for you to understand. So I'm literally going to hold your hand throughout the whole process of creating this database from scratch. And I'm not just going to show you how to build it, but I'm actually going to take the time to explain the steps as to why I'm adding particular things in, so that way you can completely comprehend how to build your own database on your own terms. Now, for the sake of this tutorial today, I've not only created this Notion checklist, which contains a list of everything we're about to add into our database, but this Notion checklist also contains a list of all of the features that we're going to build out. So you can see it's quite an extensive list. Now, what I love about Notion is that it gives you the ability to add a checklist item, so you can tick these off as you add them into Bubble. And if you wanted to duplicate this exact same template, I'll be sure to include a link in the description of this video, so that way you can create a copy and follow along with me. Now, as I mentioned, at the top of this checklist, I've broken down everything we're about to add into our own Bubble database. And when it comes to building out databases in Bubble, there's two key things you'll need to understand. And that is the difference between a data type and then a data field. Now, a data type is an overall entity, which if you're new to Bubble, I know that sounds like complete gibberish. So to put it in simple terms, a data type is a thing that users will create inside of your app. And so what I like to do before I even open up Bubble is just write a list of everything I want my app to do. And so if we were creating an Eventbrite clone, I might want people to register accounts, I'd like them to create events, I'd like them to purchase tickets, and the list just goes on. And by taking the time to evaluate how our app is going to function, we can easily identify what things our users need to create inside of our app. And 9 times out of 10, if a user needs to actually create something in your database, that will be a data type. So you'll see here, I have a list of data types. These are my larger headings. So I have things like a user, an event, the event details, and a ticket. And so each of these is an item that a user is going to create at some point in my app. So with our user data type, a user is going to need to create a user account. So whenever they register an account, we'll create a new entry in our database. And so that's what I mean by it being an overall entity. So it is a thing of its own that's going to be created. And I'll be sure to explain all of these data types as I add them into my database. But the second concept you'll need to understand is the importance of data fields. So inside of our data type, which if you remember is an overarching thing or an entity, we might want to store some information about that thing. So if a user was to register a user account, we'd like to store information about things like their name, their bio, and their profile photo. So data fields are all of the bits of information you want to store in your data type. And so my data fields are all of the checkboxes you see here. Because as I just mentioned, under our user data type, we're storing things like their name, their bio, and a profile photo. And when we add these into our database, I'll explain how we can change the different formats of data that you can store in your database. So whether you want something to be stored as text, a file, an image, a number, and the list just goes on. And so it's at this point that we can finally open up our brand new Bubble editor. Now I've created this editor here from scratch. I haven't made any changes to it. And as I mentioned, before we go ahead and build out any of the core features, we're going to open up our data tab here. And the first thing you might notice is that you have a pre-created data type by default inside of your database. So within Bubble here, under our data types tab, all of your data types will be displayed on the left-hand side. And then whenever you select on a data type, all of your data fields within that type will be displayed on the right-hand side. Now, as you can see, we already have an existing user data type. And the reason for that is because whenever a user signs up for your application, they have to register an account. So Bubble adds this in by default, and it saves you having to do that from scratch. I should also point out that under your user data type on the right-hand side here, you can see a list of all of the existing fields that are also added by default. And one of those fields is the email. And this is already pre-created for us because when a user registers an account, they're going to have to store an email and a password. Now, Bubble actually does also store a password data field by default, but you just won't be able to see this in plain text for security reasons, but it is there, so you don't need to create that as a separate field. Now, when it comes to the process of building out your database, the first thing I like to do is add in all of my data types, before I then go on to build out my additional data fields. And the reason I do that is because, as you'll see in a moment, some data fields actually link to different data types. And I'll be sure to explain more on that when we get there. But let's start by adding in all of our data types, and I can explain why we're adding in each of these options. So if I jump back into my Notion checklist, we can already see that our user data type has been added. So I don't need to add that. The next data type is our event data type. And so as I mentioned before, because we're building something like an event marketplace, where users can come and publish and host events, users are going to need to create an event in our database every single time they want to build a listing. And so that's why our event data type is its own separate entity, because users are going to create events. So I'm going to jump into Bubble here, and I'm going to create a new data type called event. I'll just create this, and that's all we'll need to do here. We'll jump back into Notion and scroll down our list, and the next thing you'll notice is that I have this separate data type called event details. Now this raises another important point that I want to cover within this module of our tutorial, and that is how you can actually build a database correctly to maintain the longevity of your app. So essentially, how you can make sure your app doesn't slow down by storing too much data incorrectly. And before I explain what this data type is used for, I'd just like to quickly cover how Bubble works when it comes to loading items from your database. So let's say we have a home page, and on that page, we have a list of events that we want to display. So for this scenario, let's say we're going to display 20 events in our database. Now, every single time Bubble loads an event, it's going to load all of the data fields that belong to that event. Even if you're not displaying those data fields, it will still load them. Now, while that's fine if you're going to load small little details about things like, for instance, a location, a price, or even a date and time, when it comes to larger files, so things like long form text descriptions, or even let's say a list of images, all of these will quickly add up and slow your application down if you're loading all of that data for, let's say, 20 events at once. And so that's why I've created a separate data type here known as the event details. So the event details just separates all of the heavier data fields, so things that are going to contain more data and information, and it just splits those from the main event data type. So that way, if I ever need to load events, it won't need to load all of these images. But what I'm going to do is create a connection later on between these two data types. So that way, if I ever, let's say, load an event page, so if I want to display the full details of a specific event, I could still reference all of the full description as well as the list of images for that event. But for now, I just wanted to take the time to highlight the difference between these two data types. So they will still do the same thing. However, if we just want to optimize the long-term performance of our app, this is why I've split these into two separate types. So what we're going to do is jump into Bubble and add a new data type called event details. I'll choose to create this. Then if we jump back into Notion, we can scroll on down and I can see that I have one more data type, which is known as a ticket. So whenever someone purchases a ticket for an event, we're going to need to create a new ticket in our database. So if we jump back into Bubble, I'm going to create a new data type and I'm going to call this a ticket. And thankfully, that is all of the data types we'll need to add in. There's not too many for this build. However, just when you thought you were starting to get the hang of things, I'm going to throw another curveball in your direction. And if I scroll on down, you'll see that I've added what's known as a list of option sets here. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, I don't expect you to have any idea what option sets are. It took me a couple months before I actually could understand these when I got started on my Bubble journey. But option sets are essentially a way to create data that already exists in your database. And again, if you're brand new to Bubble, I don't expect you to understand anything I just said. So let me break it down in an easier to understand example. If data types store information that your users are creating in your database, how can you as the admin of your application have control over what data you would like to add into the app? So let's say, for instance, every time a user in your app publishes an event, they need to select a category that that event belongs to. Instead of allowing your users to create a category in every instance, what we could do is create a way for them to select from a list of pre-created categories that we as the admin have determined. And so why would you want to do that? I'm going to be completely real with you. The last thing you want to do is give your users control of important information like that. There's no guaranteeing that they're not going to add in duplicate categories, or they might spell a category in a different way or add a typo. So all of your categories would just quickly become a hot mess. And so this is the purpose of option sets. Option sets are like a data type that sits in your database, but only you as the admin of your app have the ability to add the data you want to store in that. And then you can reference that at any later point in time throughout your build. So to just break things down again, when it comes to data types, users can create these. When it comes to option sets, only you as the admin can create that. And now this is perfect for things like categories. So what I'd like to do today is create a single source of truth, which is a list of categories that our users can select from. So every single time a user wants to create an event or filter a list of events by a category, they're gonna have to select from my list of pre-created options. And of course, because I've created this list, I'm in control of all of the items that are displayed here. So I can guarantee that there's no typos or there's no duplicate categories. And so this is where we're gonna be using option sets in our build today. And of course, when we get to the section of our tutorial where we actually need to create that feature, I'm going to be sure to explain this in more detail yet again. But I just wanted to take a moment to dive into this right now, because if you are new to Bubble, this definitely will be a little bit confusing. And so if we were to just jump into Bubble and create this list of option sets, what you'll notice is that within your data tab across the top menu, you have this option to select from option sets. Now, if you wanted a little bit more insight as to what option sets are, there's an embedded video here you can watch. Trust me, my feelings aren't going to be hurt if you still need more explanation. But for now, I'm just going to skip this tutorial and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new option set, which is going to be called my categories. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that when I create this option set, it kind of looks like the same experience as when we create a data type. So on the left-hand side, we have my option set name. And then on the right-hand side, it kind of looks like I can create data fields inside of this option set. And that's because we essentially are. We're creating data that's going to permanently be stored in our database that we can then easily reference at a later point in time. And now when it comes to the list of categories I'm going to add in, I'm just going to add all of these categories in this existing list within my Notion checklist. So these are things like music, business, health, food and drink, and so on. So we're going to add these in now. So under our new options, I'm just going to start by adding in the music category. Then there was the business category. From here, there was the health category. There was food and drink. There was also seasonal. And finally, I also had performing arts. Now, by all means, this is just a small sample of all of the possible categories you could add in from Eventbrite. I've just kept things pretty straightforward for our tutorial today. But if you wanted to add in more categories of your own choice, I'd recommend pausing this tutorial here and just adding those in as new options. What we're going to do though is just jump back into Bubble, and after we've finished adding in our option set list, we can scroll on up to our user data type, and we can now finally add in all of our data fields. So when it comes to our user data type, whenever someone registers an account, there's some information I want to store inside of those accounts. So there's things like their name, their bio, and their profile photo. So if we jump into Bubble, we're going to head to our data types tab and open up our user data type. I'm going to choose to create a new data field under our user data type, and I'm going to start by calling this the name field. Now, every single time someone registers a name, I'm going to need to select what type of structure I want to store this data as. And thankfully, in this case, it's super straightforward. I'm just going to store this as plain text. I'll choose to create this field, and you'll now see that it's available under our user data type. The next field I'd like to create is going to be called the bio. So this is where a user can kind of add like an about me section on their profile. And this field type will once again be a text field. It's super straightforward. And then finally, I'd also like to store the profile photo. Now, one thing you might just notice is the way in which I've spelt the words profile photo. Between these two words, I haven't used a space. Instead, I've separated them with a dash. Now, the reason I do that is because this is just going to help me differentiate between what is a data type and what is a data field. So when I create my data types, I separate any words with spaces. However, when I create my data fields, I separate words with a dash. So that way later on in Bubble, when I need to reference a particular data type or a data field, I know which one belongs to which particular category. And that's just because I've structured these in a certain format. So that's a little helpful tip I'd recommend following. But for our profile photo data field, I'm going to set this field type to be an image. I'll choose to create that. And that is all of the data fields we'll need to store under our user. Now again, for our tutorial today, I'm going to keep things pretty straightforward. We're not going to actually be storing too much information about our users per se. But if you ever wanted to store any additional information about your users, you could pause this tutorial here and add in any additional data fields you need. I'm just going to jump back into Bubble though, and I'm going to tick off that we've finished adding in all of our data fields under our user data type. Then we're going to scroll on down to our event data type here. And when it comes to these fields, I'm going to add in first of all a title for an event. So we'll jump back into Bubble, open up our event data type, and I'm going to start by creating a field known as the title. This will once again just be a plain text field. I'll choose to create this. I'm also going to create another field which is known as the description summary for this event. So the description summary is just going to be a small bit of text that just highlights in one sentence roughly what this event is going to be focused on. So for this field type, I'm going to select this to once again be a text type. It's super straightforward. I'll create that. Then for every event that's created, I'd also like to store the price of this. So I'm going to create a field here. I'll call this the price. Now for this field type, we're actually going to set this to be a number. And the reason for that is because if you select something to be a number, you can actually format that at a currency, as well as perform calculations on this. So if I ever want to calculate how much revenue someone's events have generated in aggregate, I can easily perform a calculation using a number. So that's why we're going to select that this field type should in fact be a number. I'll then create this. From here, we'll add another field, and this is going to be called the featured image. So this is kind of like the profile photo for an event. And as you probably guessed, this field type is going to be an image. I can create this. Then after that, we're going to create yet another field, and this one will be called our location. So this is going to be the exact address where this event is going to be hosted. And this field type will be a geographic address, which later on I'm going to explain how we can link this to Google Maps. So that way we can reference a series of real world addresses. We'll just create this. Then after adding in that data field, we're going to create one known as the organizer. So if a user is working for something like an organization and they want to list that organization as the host of this event, this is the field that will enable them to do that. And for this field, I'm just going to set this as a text type. We'll create that. I'd also like to create a field which is just going to reference the date and time in which this event will be hosted. And so for this field name, I'm going to call this date/time, and I'll set this field type to be a date. And so now whenever we create this date, it's going to be formatted as a proper date and timestamp within our database. We can create that there. Then we're going to build another field, and this is going to be called tickets available, in which I can see I've just added a small typo there. Let me fix that. So if we set this field type to be a number, we can allow a host of an event to determine how many tickets are available for this event. So that way they can cap it off at a certain limit. So I'm going to choose to create this. Then I'm going to create another field, and this is going to be called tickets sold. And so this is going to allow us to keep track of how many tickets have been sold. So that way we can make sure it doesn't actually exceed the ticket cap. Now for this field type, this is also going to be a number. We'll create this. I'll then go on to create another field called views. So this is just going to be used for the purpose of analytics when someone needs to view how many page views their event has received. So every single time someone loads a page, we're going to increase the number of views that this event has received by 1. And for this field type, as you probably guessed, this is also going to be a number. We'll then choose to create this here. And we're almost at the end of our list. The next thing I'd like to do is create a field which is going to link a category to this event. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of Bubble databases come to life. So if I was to create a new field here, I'm going to call this the category of the event. Now for this field type, instead of setting this as a text category, of course, by this point in time, we've already created a list of pre-vetted categories that we as the admin can control. And so if we scroll on down, we can actually link this field type to our option set categories. And so what we've done is we've just created a relation between this data field and our separate data type. So now we can reference and store any category stored within our option set into this data field. And look, when we go to create an event, I'll show you how that's going to function. But for now, we're just going to create this field here. And finally, there is one very last data field I'd like to build out, and that's going to create another link in our database. Only this time we're going to link our event data type to our event details. So that way, if we ever need to display the full details of an event, Bubble will easily be able to identify and display the relevant information. So I'm going to create a new field under our event data type, and I'm going to call this the full details. And for this field type, we're going to scroll on down and link this to our separate event details data type. And so every single time we create an event, we're also going to link it to those individual details. I'll then choose to create this. And that's actually all of the data fields we'll need to add into our event data type. So if we jump back into Notion, we can highlight all of these fields once again and choose to tick those off. And before we go on to build our event details data fields, I can see there is one thing I forgot to mention under our profile photo data field for our user data type. And that is that I would like to actually upload a default profile photo that every single account has. So let's say someone registers an account in our database. On our registration page, we're most likely going to store their name. However, we might not store their profile photo until we actually let them go to a settings page and upload a custom image. And so what I'd like to do is give them a default profile photo, which is just going to look like an avatar. And I just wanted to make a note of this so that way I could point it out and show you how you can actually make changes in your database like this as well. But if we were to jump into Bubble and open up our user data type here, under our profile photo, you can see we have this option to upload a default image. So that means that every user that's created will automatically have this exact same profile photo. And if I set this to be something like an avatar, it's just going to ensure that we'll never have an empty image field in our application. So I'm just going to select on this default image here, and I'm going to upload an image I have stored on my local device. And as you'll see, our avatar image has been uploaded. And if you want to use the exact same image that I've just uploaded, what I've done is I've actually created a Google Drive folder with a link to all of the images I'm going to upload today. So later on, we're going to upload some custom icons as well as a header image. And you can see here, I have our user profile photo that I've just uploaded as the default image. So you can download a version of that and upload that as well. So that way you can make sure you follow along with the exact same steps as my tutorial. If I just jump back into Bubble though, what I'd like to do is open up my event details data type, and I'm just going to add in the two data fields I had listed out in my Notion checklist. So if I scroll on down to my event details, I can see that I'd like to store two large data fields. One is going to be the full description, and the other is going to be a list of images. So I'm going to jump into Bubble, create a new data field, and I'm going to call this the full description. I'll set this field type to be a text field because we're obviously going to be storing a long paragraph of text. I'll choose to create this. And then finally, I'll create another field known as images. Now within this field, I'd like to actually store a list of images that someone uploads. And so for this field type, I'm going to select that this should be an image, but I'm also going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries, which just means that someone can now upload multiple images to one event. I'll then choose to create this, and that's all of the data fields we'll need to add into this data type. So we can jump back into Bubble, we can check those off, and the very last series of data fields we'll need to upload is within our ticket data type. So if we jump into Bubble here, we're going to open up our ticket data type, and within this first field, what I'm going to want to do is actually link this ticket to an event that it was purchased for. So I'm going to create a field known as the original event. And I'm just going to abbreviate this by calling this OG event. And of course, this field type is going to be linked to our separate event data type. So that way I can store the full details of an event within this particular field. I'll choose to create this. I'd also like to create another field known as the ticket number. So every single time a ticket is purchased, I'm going to give it a unique number. And for this field type, contrary to what you might think, it's not going to be a number. It's just going to be a text field. The reason why I've selected a text field and not a number is because numbers are used for things like currencies or calculations. And I don't ever need to perform a calculation on someone's ticket number. Instead, I just need to display that as if it's just text. So that's why I've selected the text field type. I'll choose to create this. And then finally, I'm going to add in the last data field, and this is going to be called the attended field. So this is just going to determine if someone has attended the event or not. And this field type is going to be a yes/no option because someone either has attended the event or they have not attended it. So I'm going to select that that should be the field type. I'll create this, and I'm actually going to give this a default value of no, because of course by default, someone has not yet attended that event until we mark them as attended when they show up on the day. And that is the very last data field we'll need to add within our ticket data type. So we can jump back into Notion and check off all of these items within my list. But before we move on, there is one very last thing I'd just like to highlight, and that is within our bubble editor, you may have noticed that under our data types here, our user data type had this default privacy rule applied to it. Now, if I was to click on this, it's going to take us through to our privacy tab. And as I just mentioned, Bubble has automatically applied a privacy rule to our user data type, which in simple terms, it just means that users are only able to see the information that they create, not the information that anyone else creates. Now, while this privacy rule could be helpful for something like an internal tool, this actually isn't the experience we want to create today. Because we're building something like a marketplace where people can host events and share events, we want users to be able to see events that other users create. So what we're going to do is actually just take the time to delete this privacy rule, and you'll now see that your user data type is publicly visible. So that's exactly what you want. Please just make sure you take the time to do this now. I really don't want you to be one of those people who sends me a message and says that they can't see information about their users, when in reality, you just didn't take the 2 seconds to delete this privacy rule here. But thankfully, after taking care of that, that is everything we need to build out within our own database. It's truly crazy that we've just created an entire database from scratch without having to write a single line of code using Bubble's toolset. Now that we've finished taking the time to build out our database, we can move on down to the full list of features that I have set out for us in our Notion checklist today. And look, as you can see, it's quite an extensive list that I want to walk through. When it comes to Eventbrite, there are so many unique features that make up the overall platform. And so to make things as easy as possible, what I wanted to do is break these down into individual steps. So that way it'll help just make the build much more manageable. Now at the very top of my list here is the feature where we're going to build out the homepage. So this is going to be one of the core pages that users interact with throughout our platform today. And when it comes to this homepage, there is quite a bit involved, but of course it's my job to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as possible. So what we're going to do is first of all jump over into our Bubble editor. And what you'll notice inside of Bubble is that by default we have this index page which is pre-created inside of any editor. Now the index page is simply just the home page that's going to automatically display whenever a user actually visits your application. And so this is the page we're going to build out the home section of our Eventbrite clone today. Now before we can actually add any elements onto the page, there's a few little bits of housekeeping we'll need to take care of. And so if I was to double click on this page, we'll open up our property editor inside of Bubble, and this is where we can make changes to any elements we add onto the page, including the actual page itself. So you'll see here that we're currently referencing the overall index page. Now, one personal preference of mine when I'm working on any page inside of Bubble is that I just like to update the background color of this. What I'm going to do is select this to be a light shade of gray, so that way I can actually see where the background of this page lies inside of my Bubble editor. So if I set this to be a shade of gray, and if I was to click away from this, I can now actually see where the constraints of my page lie. I'll also then need to double click on my page once again, because before we add any elements onto our page, we'll need to jump over into our layout tab, and we'll need to set a container layout for the page itself. Now, the container layout will determine in which direction elements are displayed on your page. So if I was to open up this drop-down menu, you're going to see 4 different options. Now, to simplify this entire process, I personally only ever use one of these 2 options here. So there's the row or the column. And the difference between the 2 is that if you were to select the row option, it would display any elements you add onto the page horizontally across the page itself. So it would position them side by side. Whereas if you select the column option, it would allow you to stack elements from top to bottom. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this is just by showing you an example. So if I select the row option, and then if I was to just grab 2 buttons and add them onto my page, what you'll see is that these 2 button elements sit side by side. So they're positioned horizontally across my page. However, if I was to then select on my page again, jump to my layout tab and update the container layout to be a column, it's going to stack these on top of each other. And look, in 99% of use cases, I will always set the container layout to be a column for an overall page. Because when you think of most modern web applications or even mobile apps, all of the elements are stacked from the top down. Now, of course, there will be sections where we can stack elements side by side within that page. But in terms of the overall page structure, these will be positioned from top to bottom. So that's why I'm selecting the column option here today. Now, from here, I'm just going to delete these two buttons. We don't need those right now. But the very first thing I'd like to do is add a hero image to my actual Eventbrite homepage. And perhaps what I should do is even open up the real-world Eventbrite product. Because what you'll see on this homepage is, first of all, we have this navigation menu at the top of our overall page. Now, we are going to be creating a navigation menu in a separate section of our tutorial today. But below that menu, we then have a hero image. Now, Eventbrite has one of two images that will often display. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've saved one of those images for us. And we're going to add that image to our own bubble editor. Now, thankfully, I've gone ahead and I've done the hard work for you here. So in the link of this video, what you'll find is a link to a Google Drive folder where I've uploaded a series of images that we're going to reference throughout our tutorial today. And you'll see here we have this hero image. So if you download that, that's the image I'm about to use in the section of our page here. So what I'm going to do is jump to my bubble editor. I'm going to head to my visual elements and I'm going to grab an image element. And for this image, I'm going to upload a static image from my own local device. So this is going to be that image I just shown you in our Google Drive. And once this image is uploaded, what you'll see is that, of course, we're going to need to reformat this because at this point in time, this image is quite squished. So in order to fix this image and also make it fully responsive on our page, what we're going to do is jump over to our layout tab. And this is where we'll be able to control both the height and width settings of this image. And so when it comes to the width of this element, what I'm going to do today is unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now, a fixed width in Bubble just essentially means that the image will only ever be this particular size. So if you were to leave this as a fixed width, it would be 320 pixels across your page, no smaller and no larger. And that, of course, is not the experience we want to create. Instead, I want to create an image today that not only expands out and takes up as much space as it can on the page, but also shrinks down and reduces in size whenever a user is on a smaller device like mobile. So that's how we're going to create a truly responsive experience that looks gorgeous across any device. And so what we're going to do is, as I mentioned, unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now, when it comes to creating responsive elements in Bubble, you're going to hear me use this strategy time and time again today. But when it comes to the minimum and maximum values of any element, if I was to set the minimum width of this to be 0 pixels and leave the maximum width as infinite, that means that this element here can, at its smallest possible size, be 0 pixels. So that means as the page shrinks, it will continue to always shrink down right to 0 pixels. Whereas at the same time, when it has a maximum width of infinite, that means it will always be able to expand out and take up as much space as it needs as well. So if I was to jump over to my responsive tab here and just close my property editor, what you'll see is that as I expand the width of our page out, this image will stretch out, and as I shrink this, the image will scale down as well. But what I'm also going to need to do is update the height of this image. So if we just jump back to our UI builder, double click on the image and head to our layout tab once again. What I'm going to do is set the minimum height of this image to be 0, but I'm going to set a maximum height to be 400 pixels, which now means that at its largest possible height, this image will be no larger than what you see on our screen right now. And that is how we can format this to look more like a hero image on our page. And thankfully, that's all we'll need to edit when it comes to this particular image here. Below this image though, what I want to do is create an experience that allows someone to determine what location they'd like to view events in. So if we were to jump over to the real world Eventbrite product here and scroll on down, you'll see we have this option to select from events in a particular location. So right now it's just displaying a default location of where you currently are based. Now I'm not based in San Francisco, but I have set that as my default location in our application here. And so what you'll notice is that all of the events on our page here are all events based in San Francisco. Whereas if I was to update this to something like Los Angeles, the events that are being displayed would also update in real time. And that is, of course, an experience we can replicate inside of Bubble. So what we're going to do now is just focus on replicating this small section here, which just pulls someone's existing location and allows them to also update that. Now, one thing I should just point out about this section here is that when I view this application, I can see we have kind of two separate elements broken down on this page. So to the left, there's this text here, which displays the words popular in. And then to the right, we have this search box, which allows us to type in a location. Now, these two elements are actually being positioned side by side on our page, which means that if our overall page has a container layout set to be a column, which means we're stacking elements from top to bottom, we're going to need to create some sort of way to display these two elements side by side. And thankfully, this is a super straightforward process in Bubble. So if we jump back into our Bubble editor, what I'm actually going to do before I add the text or search box element onto my page is add what's known as a group element. So if I head over to my containers menu here, you'll see the option to add a group element onto your page. Now, a group in Bubble kind of acts like a page inside of your existing page. So you can think of this element here as its own little page inside of my overall page, as I just mentioned. And because a group functions like a page, we have the ability to update its own container layout. So any elements that sit inside of this mini page here can have a separate container layout from our overall page itself. So what I can do is set the container layout of this group to be a row, which means any elements in this are going to be positioned side by side. Now, one thing I personally like to do when I'm working with groups is just jump over to my appearance tab, and I like to actually remove the style of the group just because I like to give them a flat color, and I might set that to something like red for the time being. Now, the reason why I'm setting this to be a color like red is because when you're building a page inside a Bubble, and when you start adding multiple groups throughout different sections of your page, if they don't have a background color, it can be a little difficult to see where all your groups are positioned on the page. And so if I was to give these groups a flat background color and set them to be something quite bright, to me, it kind of just feels like I'm building an application with different Lego bricks. So I can see where I'm stacking all of my different elements on top of each other. Now, of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can always just remove this background style. So if you set it back to none, it's just going to remove that. But for the time being, while we're building out our application, I'd always strongly advise you to set a flat background color on any groups, just so they don't get lost inside of your app. Now, before I add elements inside of this group, I'm going to make this group fully responsive. Because if I jump over into my layout tab, what I'll see is that this group has a fixed width of 280 pixels, which currently means that at this point in time, it will never be larger or smaller than this particular size here. And this size obviously isn't enough to fit all of my elements I want inside of it. So what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. Now, if I want to make this group fully responsive, I'm going to once again set the minimum width to be 0, and of course leave the maximum width to be infinite, which means that this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my overall page. Now, I will come back and update the height settings in a moment, but before I do that, I'm actually going to add the elements I want to display inside of this group. Now, if we were replicating the same experience from the real-world Eventbrite product, on the left-hand side here, we're going to need to add in that text element. So if we head to our visual elements, I'll grab a text element and add it into my red group. And when it comes to this text element, I'm just going to have this display some static text. This is going to show the words popular in. When it comes to the style of this text, I'm also going to update the font size to be 30. And I'm also going to select to bold this text. So that way it's more in line with the real world Eventbrite product we just looked at before. And then from here, what I'd like to do is make this text element fully responsive as well. So if we jump to our layout tab, once again, at this point in time, you'll see that by default, this element is a fixed width. And as you may remember, because this is a fixed width, it means that it will always be this size here. But I can see that because this is 200 pixels in width, we have some empty unused space to the right-hand side here. So what I'm going to do is make this fully responsive by unselecting that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0. I will, of course, leave the maximum width as infinite. But what I'm actually going to do is tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And what you'll now see is that that's going to wrap nicely around both of the text words inside of the element itself. When it comes to the height, I'm also going to set the minimum height here to be 0, which just means that the height will also collapse and wrap nicely around the height of all of the text inside of this element. And then finally, while we're in our layout tab, I'm going to vertically align this text element in the center of our red group, which just means it's going to be positioned directly in the center. So that way, when we add a search box next to this, I can make sure that both of these elements are perfectly aligned. Now, beside this, as I've alluded to, I'd like to add in a search box, which will allow a user to add in a location from which they can search for events by. And so if we scroll on down to our input forms, you'll see this option to add a search box element. So I'm going to add that into my red group here. Now, when it comes to working with any input fields, the first thing I like to do is not update the responsive settings or any of the styling. Instead, I like to take the time to update the naming conventions of this particular input. And the reason for that is because when you create any workflows in the future or choose to store any information in your database, you're going to need to reference these input fields which store information that, of course, your users have input. And so in order to easily identify which input field we'd like to reference, we can give these a unique name. So if we just click up in the top of our property editor, we can give this a custom name. So I'm going to call this one search box location because I'm going to have this one search through a list of locations. And that's all we'll need to change for here. Now we can actually focus on how we're going to have this input field search and display a series of addresses. So under our choices style here, a search box gives you 3 different options. You can search through a list of static choices, a list of dynamic choices, which essentially just means data stored in your database, or another use case is by searching through a list of geographical places. And so if you select this option here, this search box is automatically going to be integrated with Google Maps. So now you can search for any address just like you would on Google Maps, and it will structure and format that as an address. And what I love about when you're working with addresses is that you can actually choose to extract values from it. So for instance, you could extract the city of an address, you could extract the country, and so on. And so we're going to leave this as a list of geographic places. Now, when it comes to this search box, of course, a user could always update the particular city that they're searching for events in. But what I'd like to do is by default, automatically pull and display the city that a user is currently located in. And so in order to do that, we can add a value in this field known as the default value. And so the default value, as the name would suggest, is the value that's automatically going to be displayed in this field as soon as the page is loaded. And in order to reference and display the current city that someone is based in, what we're going to do is select to add in some dynamic data. And we're actually not going to pull this data from our database. Instead, we're going to scroll right down to the bottom and you'll see this option to reference the current geographic position. And so now if the user has allowed location access within their browser, this is automatically going to pull their current location. And from that location, I just like to extract the city. So I'm going to select this more option and I can choose to extract from that location, and you'll see that we can select from any component here. And in this case, I just want to extract the city. And sometimes that might format as a suburb, but it's going to give you a user's core location in a generalized area. I'm then going to choose to close this and you'll see that that will validate. And from here, what I'd like to do is update the formatting of the text that's displayed inside of this search box. And so when it comes to this text, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the size of the font that's displayed. I'm going to set that to be 30. I'll also choose to bold this. And I'm going to set the text color here to be a custom shade of blue. Now, if you'd like that color code, it's 0936CA. Now, although we've updated this color, you might see that this search box is still displaying this light shade of gray for the text inside of it. And that's because it's just referring to our placeholder text. Now, placeholder text inside of an input field is just the temporary text that's displayed until a value is actually stored in it. Now, I know that might sound confusing, but we don't need to worry about it right now. Because what you need to remember is that because we've set a default value inside of this input field, there will always be a value displayed inside of this search box. So there'll never be a time where this placeholder text is shown. If you really want it though, what you could do is also update the placeholder text color here to be the same shade of blue, so that way you get an idea of what this is going to look like. But by all means, that isn't completely necessary. While we're working inside our appearance tab here, changing the style of this search box, there is one last thing I'd like to do, and that is that I want to make this search box look less like a search box. Because if we were to jump into the real-world Eventbrite product, what you'll see is that this field here doesn't actually look like a search box. It's just got some text with a location, which sits on top of an underline. And so in order to make our search box look like this, we can jump into Bubble here. And if we scroll on down, you'll see the option to update the borders of this search box. And what we can do is tick this option to define each border independently. And then from here, what I'm going to do is set the top borders to be none. So that way it removes the line across the top. I'll do the exact same thing for the right side. I will, however, keep the bottom line as solid. So that way we have that underline below the text. But I'll then also set the left border as none. And then if I was to click away from this element, what you'll see is that it no longer looks like a search box, and it replicates the same experience from the real-world Eventbrite product. Now from here, I'm just going to select on the search box once again, and we can jump over into our layout tab. And when it comes to the responsive settings of this element, what we're going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. Similar to before, I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. However, as you'll see at this point in time, if I leave the maximum width as infinite, it's going to take up quite a bit of space on my page. And that's actually not the experience I want to create. Instead, I only want it to take up, let's say, this much space on my page. So what I could actually do is set a maximum width of something like 300 pixels. Now, by all means, there's no particular scientific reason why I selected the maximum width as 300 pixels. I just think that that's going to be enough space to display all of the text or location inside of this input, but you can set that value to be whatever you would like. When it comes to the height of this element, unlike our text element, I am going to leave this as a fixed value though. And that's because the default value here is 48 pixels. So that just means that this search box is going to be no higher or smaller than what you see right now. And I'm very happy with how it's structured right now, so I'm not going to change that. Of course, what I'll also need to do is vertically align this in the center of our red group, so that way it sits perfectly in line with our existing text element. And I'd also just like to add in some spacing between these two elements. So if I head to my margins, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin on the left-hand side, and that's just going to push that over to the side. And if I was to click away, you can now see that these are positioned apart perfectly. Now, because that is the very last element I'd like to add into my overall red group, you can see we've still got all of this empty space in the red group itself. So we're going to click on that red group and we can finalize the responsive settings for this group itself. So if we head to our layout tab of our red group, the very first thing I'm going to do is come down to our minimum height, and I'm going to set this to be 0. And what you'll see is by default, we have this option selected, which fits the height of this element to the content inside of it. So that means that if the minimum height is 0, it's just going to collapse around all of the elements inside of the group itself. So it's going to fit nice and snug around both these two elements. What I'd also like to do is just scroll on down to my margins for this group. And I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top. I won't add any on the bottom, but also 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And what you'll see is that this group will no longer touch the borders of my page. Now, of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you'll most likely remove the background color of this group, but I do just want to make sure that this text element and our search box don't touch the actual hero image that they sit below. And that is all we'll need to build out for this section of our page. Moving down, the next thing I'd like to do is display a list of categories that a user could search for events by. And so if we were to jump into the real-world Eventbrite product, you'll see here that there's a list of categories. But above that, we also just have this text element that says check out these categories. And so we're going to add both of these elements in here. So if we jump back into our bubble editor, I'm going to scroll on up and add a text element below my red group. And I'm going to have this display the words check out these categories. After adding in that text, I'm also going to update the font size here to be 24. I'll choose to bold this text. And then of course, I'll need to update the responsive settings of this text. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to, like always, unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, and I'm going to leave the maximum width to be infinite. So that way this text element can take up as little or as much space as it needs on our page. Now I'm going to sound like a broken record every single time I make a element responsive today. And that's because I'm going to follow that exact same procedure time and time again. But hopefully you'll quickly learn that that is how you can create truly responsive experiences inside of Bubble. When it comes to the height, I'm going to set this to be 0. And of course, because the default option is selected here to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around our text. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element doesn't touch any of the elements that sit around it. Now below this, I'd like to add and display the list of different categories that someone could select from. And now when it comes to displaying a list of items inside a bubble, we're going to need to reference an element known as a repeating group. Now, repeating groups are going to become your best friend in Bubble. As I mentioned, every single time you need to display a list of items from your database, you will need to use a repeating group. So if I was to head to my containers menu and add a repeating group onto our page, you'll see that this almost just looks like a spreadsheet. And so a repeating group is kind of like a list of groups, hence the name. It just repeats itself over and over. And perhaps the best way to illustrate how powerful repeating groups are is by using an example you'd be familiar with. So if you were building a, let's say, photo sharing application like Instagram, and you wanted to create your homepage feed, so that's where you're going to display all of the photos and videos that have been shared, you would in Bubble add a repeating group onto your page, and inside of each cell of your repeating group, you would have a different post. So you'd have a different photo or video that someone has shared. And the same concept can apply for literally any other list of items you want to display from your database. And in our application today, we're going to be displaying a list of categories, which, if you remember, we have already created as a list of option sets. So if we were to just jump into our data tab and open up our option sets, we already have this list of categories here pre-stored in our database. So I want to display a list of all of these inside of my app. So if we jump into our design tab, the first thing you'll need to do with a repeating group is give it a data source. So that way it knows what list of items it should display. So for the type of content, I'm going to set this to be a list of categories, which is linked to my option set that we've created. Then from here, for the actual data source, Bubble's going to need to know which specific categories it should display. And thankfully, this is super straightforward. I just want to display all of my categories. It couldn't get much simpler than that. Now, after giving this a data source, this is where repeating groups can become a little bit confusing, particularly if you are brand new to Bubble. But of course, it is your boy's job here to explain everything you need to know in as much detail as I can. And so the first thing I just want to touch base on is the configurations that you see here. So right now, you'll see that this repeating group has a fixed number of rows and a fixed number of columns. So let's say if we wanted to display all of our categories, and let's say for instance, we had 6 categories inside of our option set list. Right now, because we have a fixed number of rows as 4, so as you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, and 4 rows, Bubble would currently only display the first 4 items from our database. And that is not the experience we want to create. Instead, we want to display all of the categories. So what we're going to do is unselect that should be a fixed value. And then another thing I should point out is the fact that we have a fixed number of columns. So this just determines that on each line of our repeating group, there's currently only one option that's going to be displayed. And if we were to look at the real world Eventbrite product here, you'll see that there's actually 4 columns on this particular repeating group. But for our example today, I'm also going to unselect that should not be a fixed value. And now what you'll see is the option to customize the size of each row or cell inside of your repeating group. Now, these values can often be a little bit confusing in the beginning. And the best way to illustrate what these values actually change is by just looking inside of our repeating group and identifying that right now we have 6 different cells. So you can think of this whole repeating group as a collection of 6 individual group elements. And so these values here will just determine how much space each group should have inside of our overall repeating group. So this is separate from our actual responsive settings within our layout tab, which I'm going to get to in a moment. So under our appearance tab, we're going to need to change these values because at this point in time, each group is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. So it's quite small. We can't really fit anything inside of these. And so what I like to do when I'm working with a repeating group is start by just setting the minimum values to be 300 pixels. Now again, there's nothing completely scientific about this. I just think that 300 by 300 pixels is enough space to start working within. And the other thing about repeating groups is that you'll often find that you just need to tinker around with some of the settings in order to get the perfect configuration. And that's what you're going to see me do today. I'm going to come back and change these values in a moment. But before I do that, I'd just like to update the responsive settings within our layout tab. So if we jump to our layout tab here, I'm going to head on down to our width settings. And of course, like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now what you'll see is that this repeating group here will display 3 different columns. And the reason for that is because each column is 300 pixels in width. And so because it has more space to display more columns across our page, it's automatically going to add new columns in. And perhaps I could illustrate that better by jumping into our responsive tab here. So as you'll see, as I stretch the page out and we have more space to display more columns, Bubble's automatically going to add in an additional cell. However, if I was to shrink the page, what you'll see is that these columns will collapse. So right now you can see that this repeating group is already fully responsive. So I'm just going to jump back into my UI builder for now though, because while we're within our layout tab, I'm also going to update the container layout for our repeating group. So again, because this is a group element, inside of each cell here, we can determine how elements are going to be positioned. Now, because I'm only going to add one element into this cell, it doesn't really matter if you select a row or a column, but I'm personally more of a column guy, so I'm just going to select that option here. And it's at this point that we can start adding our elements into this repeating group. And then once we've finished adding those elements into our repeating group, we'll come back and update the height settings, as well as make some final adjustments to the initial row and column settings inside of our appearance tab. And so if we were to just quickly jump back over to the real world Eventbrite product and look at how these categories are displayed inside of this repeating group, what I can see is that there's almost like a overall gray group that two elements sit inside of. So inside of this gray group, on the left-hand side, we have this little icon image, and then on the right-hand side, we have a text element that displays the actual name of this category. And so if I wanted to rebuild this inside a Bubble, I would add a gray group into my repeating group, and I would set its container layout to be a row. So that way I could place two elements side by side inside of that. So if we jump into Bubble, I'm going to scroll on down to my containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element inside of my repeating group. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do for this group is just remove the style of this, because I'd like to give this a flat background color. And look, I'm happy to leave this as white for the time being, just because my actual page itself is gray. So if I was to make this a gray group, it would probably actually blend in with my page. But of course, if you wanted to switch your background color of your page to be white and set this group to be gray, you could definitely do that. But for the time being, I'm quite happy to just leave this as white. What I'm then going to do is jump over to my layout tab, and I'm going to need to update the container layout of this particular group to be a row. And so that of course now means I can stack two elements side by side inside of this group. I'm also then going to make this group fully responsive inside of my repeating group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width to be infinite. So that way this is now going to take up as little or as much space as it can inside of my repeating group. And it's now at this point that we can start adding in the two separate elements that are going to be displayed inside of this group. So as I mentioned in our real world Eventbrite product, there was the little icon followed by the text element. Now, thankfully at this point in time, if we were to just jump into our data tab, we already have the name of every single category I want to display. So when it comes to the text element, we're all sorted. But what I'd also like to do is associate an icon with every single category. So that way when our repeating group is displaying that category, it can not only display the text, but it will also be able to display an icon. So how can we create that experience? Thankfully, when it comes to option sets, you have the ability to not only just store text information about the name of an option, but similar to any old data field, you can actually store as much information as you'd like inside of each option. And so I didn't touch base on this before because I didn't want to overwhelm you at the time, but when it comes to working with a list of options, you can create what's known as a new attribute. So currently in every single option set list, you have one default attribute, and this is known as the display text. So this is the text that you see here for every single option. But let's say for every single option, I'd also like to store an icon, so an image. What I could do is create a new attribute here, and I could call this attribute our icon. And similar to when you create a data field, you can select what type of data you'd like this to be stored as. And in this case, I want this to be an image. So if I create that, what I can now do is upload an image to every single category. And of course, we've come prepared today because in that Google Drive that I've shared with you, you'll see a list of all of the icons that you can download and upload into each individual option. And so in order to upload these images, all we need to do is modify the attributes of every single option. So first of all, there's our music option. So I'm going to modify its attributes, and now you'll see the two attributes that belong to this option. So of course, there's the display text, and then there's the icon itself. And in this case, I'm just going to upload a custom image for my icon, which this is going to be my music icon here. I'll choose to open this, and then I can choose to save that image. I'll do the exact same thing for my business category. I'll choose to upload a custom icon. I'll select my business icon. I'll open that, and then I'll choose to save this. Now I'm just going to jump ahead and modify all of the additional attributes for every single option here. But what I'd recommend is that you just pause this tutorial, download those images, and then upload those at the same time as myself here. Alright, so I've just jumped ahead and I finished uploading all of my custom icons. So what we're going to now do is just jump back into our design tab, and inside of our white group, we're going to add an image element, and of course we're going to now display the icon for each category. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, what we're going to do is grab an image element and add that into our group. And it's at this point in time that we can reference our first dynamic value for an element itself. And so if we wanted to reference the value stored in our database for this particular option set, what you could do is choose to insert dynamic data and pull the value from our database where we're storing that image. And the image I'd like to display is going to be the image for the categories within our repeating group. So if I was to just jump over to the real world Eventbrite product, for the performing arts category, would obviously like to display the relevant icon for that. For the music category, we'll display the relevant music icon. And so in order to do this, we actually need to reference the value from each repeating group cell. Because of course, we just need to remember that each cell in our repeating group is an individual category. But because this image sits inside of a group, which sits inside of our repeating group, we actually need to pass some data on like a chain for all of these elements. So if I was to select on my white group, which sits inside of my repeating group, I'm going to need to give this a type of content, and I'm going to have it pull the value of the category from the repeating group it sits within. So for the type of content for this particular group, I'm going to have this be a category, which is linked to our option set list. And then for the data source, I'm going to have this reference the current cells category. So within our repeating group, it's going to reference the relevant category. So in our first cell, we might have the music category. In our second cell, we'll have the business category, and so on. And so now this group has the ability to pass this data of the category onto our image element. And so you can kind of think of this whole setup as one of those little Russian dolls that continually just open up and pull new layers out of. So right now we have 3 different elements that are all sharing a data source. And so for this image, if I wanted to display the icon of the relevant category, what I could do is reference the parent group's category. Now the parent group is known as our white group. So because our image sits inside of the white group is taking care of that image, kind of like a parent. So that's just why it's called the parent group. And of course, because we're storing the value of a category in our parent group, we can either reference its icon or its display text. And in this case, I want to reference the icon. And if I click away, that is going to validate. And while we're in our appearance tab, I'm also going to remove the style of this image. When I'm working with repeating groups and images, I just like to give these a solid border, just so that way I can actually see where they sit on my page. And of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you can just remove that border. But for the time being, this is going to save a lot of confusion having to guess where your actual element is. Now, while we're working on this image, we're going to jump over to our layout tab and we're going to update the size and dimensions of this image. And for this image, unlike any other element I've added onto our page before, I am in fact going to leave this as a fixed value. And I'm going to set the width here to be 60 pixels. And if I keep that as a fixed value, that means that this image is going to be no larger or no smaller than this current size. And you'll see why I do that in a moment. But what I'm also going to do is select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed at a 1:1 ratio, which now means that this is going to be a perfect square. And so because this is a fixed value, this image will always remain this size, which is the exact experience I want to create. I don't want it to become larger as the page expands. I'll always want it to be this exact size here. So that's why I've selected that this should be a fixed value. I'll also vertically align this in the center of my white group, and that's all I'll need to add for this particular icon. The next thing I'll need to do is just add in my text element that's going to display the name of this category. So if we jump to our visual elements and add a text element inside of our white group, we're going to insert dynamic data and we're going to reference the parent group's category the display text. Now, when it comes to this text, I'm just going to update the size of this to be 16. And I'm not actually going to bold this text, but I would just like to update the font weight here to be 600, which is a semi-bold. And that's all I'll need to change within our appearance tab. But what we will need to do is jump over into our layout tab here. And for this text element, I would like to make this fully responsive. Unlike our image, I don't want this to be a permanent fixed value. I want this text to take up as little or as much space as it can. So like always, if I want to make a fully responsive element, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width to be infinite. I'm also going to close all the empty space in our height here. So I'm going to set the minimum height to also be 0. I will vertically align this text in the center of my white group. And then finally, I'm just going to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border of this text element. So that way our text doesn't touch any elements beside it or even the borders of my white group. Now, thankfully, that is everything we'll need to add into this white group itself. And so what we can now do is select on the white group and close off all of this empty space that we have. So if we jump to our layout tab for our white group, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And now you'll see that that's going to collapse nicely around both of the elements that sit inside of it. Then from here, I'd like to make sure that this white group doesn't touch the borders of our repeating group cell, because I can see all of these groups are currently connected. And that's not the experience I want to create. So within our layout tab, I'm going to scroll on down to our margins, and I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, but I'm going to add in 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And as you can see, that makes a much cleaner design. And that's all we'll need to change for this group. So what we can now do is select on our overall repeating group and close off all of this empty space at the bottom of each repeating group cell. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm now going to set the minimum height of each repeating group cell to also be 0. But of course, as you might notice, there's still all of this empty space here. And the reason for that is because within our appearance tab, we still have these default values added for the minimum height of each row and the minimum width of each column. And so if I was to set the minimum height of each row to be 0, it's going to now collapse around every element inside of the row itself. So thankfully that closes off all of that empty space. And to be honest, the minimum width of each column actually turned out pretty good at 300 pixels. However, what I'd like to do is actually set this to be 320 pixels. Now, there actually is a specific reason why I selected 320 pixels here. And the reason for that is because if we were to jump over into our responsive tab here, and if we were to view this on a mobile device, what you'll see is that at the smallest possible device size, this is going to be 320 pixels. So from my experience, if you're viewing an application on something like an iPhone 14, the average screen size is about 380 pixels to 420 pixels. However, on the smallest possible mobile device available, which is something like an iPhone 5, which trust me, it blows my mind that people still use those, people are going to be viewing your application at 320 pixels, which currently looks like this. So you can see that on our page, we still have a few settings we need to update for our responsive design, which we'll come back to in a moment. But if we were to set the minimum width of each column to be 320 pixels for our repeating group, it's going to be fully responsive on the smallest possible mobile device size. But of course, as we expand the page out, it's going to continually expand and also add in additional columns. So now we have a fully responsive repeating group. The absolute last thing I want to change on this repeating group though within our UI builder here is that I just want to add 10 pixels of margin at the top of this repeating group. So that way it doesn't directly touch the text element that sits above it. So I'm going to jump to my layout tab and just add in 10 pixels of margin at the top. And thankfully that is everything we'll need to add for this repeating group here. What we could actually do is just run a quick preview of this within our browser. And the first thing you'll notice here is that our categories are now being displayed. And of course we have our icon element, which is positioned beside the actual text of each category. So I just wanted to show you what this actually looks like now while we're actually working our way through the build. Now, of course, as I mentioned, we will come back and update the responsive settings of all the things like our hero image. But before we do that, I'd like to add in the very last element onto our core page here. And that's going to be the list of all of the actual events that are displayed to people. And so in order to display another list of items, we're going to jump back into our bubble editor and we're going to need to add yet another repeating group onto our page. And so we're going to head over to our containers menu and add in yet another repeating group element. Only this time we're going to need to set a different data source because for this repeating group, I'd like to display a list of events in our database. So the first thing we'll need to do is jump over into our Appearance tab here, and I'm going to update the type of content to display a list of events. Now, when it comes to the data source for this repeating group, it's going to be quite different to the very first repeating group that displayed a list of categories. And the reason for that is because when we displayed this list of categories, we had pre-created all of the categories we wanted to show. Whereas when it comes to our events, because events are user generated, so our users create these events, we're actually going to need to perform a search in our database for all of the events that match a certain criteria. And so if we head to our data source here, as I mentioned, we're going to start by performing a search for something in our database. And this is where you'll really start to see the power of repeating groups come to life. So for the type of thing we're going to search for, this is going to be a list of events. Now at this point in time, this repeating group would display literally every event that's been created in our database. Whereas I actually want to filter those out to only the events that are within the same region as the current user's location. So what we're going to do is add what's known as a constraint, which is kind of like a filter. And I'm only going to display the events where the location is within. Now it's entirely up to you to determine what kind of geographic field you want to add around a user. But in my application today, what I'd like to do is display a list of all of the events that are located within 50 kilometers of the current user's location. Or I should say their preferred location. So whatever value they've typed into this search box. So I'm going to recognize where the event's location is within. I'm then going to type in a manual number. So I'm going to type in the number 50. Now, if you wanted yours to be 100, you could just type in the number 100. I'm then going to reference kilometers. Of course, if you were using an imperial system, you could leverage miles, but I'm just going to stick with kilometers. And the actual target location is going to be the location selected within our search box here. So I'm going to scroll on down to our search box location and reference its value. And of course, by default, this search box is going to pull the city in which someone lives within. And so that means right away, this repeating group is going to display a list of events based on the current city of a user. But if the user was to then also update the location manually within the search box, this data source would dynamically change, which just means that its changes are going to reflect that new value. I'm also going to add an additional constraint here because I obviously only want to display events that have not yet occurred. So these are events that are yet to happen in the future. So I'm just going to reference the date time field for the events, and I'm only going to display events where the date time is in fact greater than the current date time. So if I just scroll on down and reference the current date time, this will now only display events in the future. From here, I'm also going to choose to sort these in a random order. So if I scroll on down, I'll select the random sorting option. And that's just going to ensure that every event will get an even amount of distribution. And that is all we'll need to add into our data source here. Thankfully, there wasn't too much involved, but this definitely was different to the very first repeating group that we created. So I just wanted to highlight all of the unique details here. We'll then choose to close this. Then when it comes to a number of rows and columns, similar to before, I'm going to unselect that these should be a fixed value. I'm also going to set the minimum values here to be 300. And of course, I'll come back and update these in a moment. But what I'll also need to do is jump over into my layout tab and update the full width settings of this entire repeating group. So I'm going to head to my width here. I will unselect that should be a fixed width. Like always, I will set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And then what I'd also like to do is update the container layout for our repeating group to be a column. Now, similar to our first repeating group, I'm going to add a group inside of our repeating group. So it doesn't really matter what option you select for the container layout here. Once again, I just prefer columns personally, so I'm going to choose that option for now. Now, inside of this repeating group cell, if we were to jump over to the real-world Eventbrite product, you'll just see that inside of each cell, we have this white group, which contains a featured image for this event, the name of the event, the time of the event, and also the creator of the event. And so what we're going to do is start by adding in this white group that's going to contain all of this additional information. So if we jump over into our bubble editor, I'm going to grab a group element and add this inside of my repeating group. Now for this group, the very first thing I'm going to do is jump to my appearance tab. I'm going to remove the style of this and I'm going to give it a flat background color and I'll be leaving that as white. I'll also then jump over to my layout tab and update the container layout of this group to be a column. Because as you saw in the real world Eventbrite product, we're going to be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. I'm then going to choose to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And it's from this point that we can start adding in all of the elements I'd like to display. So for each event, the very first thing I'd like to show is just going to be the featured image for it. So if we head to our visual elements, I'm going to grab an image element and add this into our white group. But similar to before, because this image actually sits inside of a group, which sits inside of our repeating group, I'm going to need to pass some data on from our repeating group into our white group, so that way I can reference it for my image. And so if I quickly just divert and select my white group, I'm going to set a type of content on this group to be an event, because I'd like to display the details of an event within it. Then for the data source, I'm going to have this be the current cell's event, which means that it's going to extract data from the current cell in our repeating group. I can then select on my image, and for the dynamic image value, I'm going to insert dynamic data, which just means we're going to be pulling data from our database. And in this case, I'm going to reference the parent group's event, remembering that the parent group is the white group that manages this image. I'll reference its featured image. Now, when I'm working with dynamic images, what I personally like to do is select this more option. And this is purely just a personal preference of mine, but I always like to choose this option to process this image with ImgX, just because you'll soon see this additional menu from which I can take this option to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them. So that just means that if the image doesn't fit the full size of this actual element, it will just automatically expand it out and crop it so it becomes a perfect size. And you'll see what that looks like when I run a preview of our app in a moment. But that's all I'm going to change here. So I'm going to choose to close that. While I'm working with images, I also like to add a solid border around them, so that way I can actually see where they sit on my page. So I'm going to remove the style of this image. I will set a solid border around this. Then we can jump to our layout tab and update the responsive settings of this image. Like always, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So now this image can take up as little or as much space as it needs inside of our white group. And then finally, when it comes to the height of this image, before I change anything here, I'm actually going to select this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And I'm going to set this to be a 2:1 ratio, which means that however wide this image is, it's going to be half that size in height. So now it's going to create a perfect rectangle. And that's all I'll need to add for this image here. Below this, I'd like to add in the actual title of the event. So I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'll grab a text element and add this into my white group. For this text element, I will insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the parent group's event, its title. So now whichever event is displayed within each cell of our repeating group, it will display the full title of that event. Now for this text element, I'm just going to update the font size here to be 18. I'll choose to bold this, and then I'll jump over into my layout tab because I'd like to make this element fully responsive. Of course, as you probably guessed, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width here to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll also set the minimum height to be 0. And then finally, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but also 10 on the left and 10 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element won't touch the borders of my white group. Now from here below this, I'd like to display the time in which this event is going to be taking place. And in order to streamline that entire process, I'm actually just going to select on this text element. I'll make a copy of that. I'll select on my white group and paste in another version. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you copy across elements, it also copies across the layout settings. And so that just means that this element is fully responsive by default, so we don't need to update these settings again. The only thing I'll need to change is within our appearance tab, and that is the dynamic value I'm displaying for this text. So instead of referencing the parent group's event's title, I'd like to reference the parent group's event, its date time. And what I love about working with dates is that you can actually choose to format these as a custom type. So if I open up this drop-down menu, you'll see the option here to reference any of these existing formats. But there is one problem with any of these options, and that is that it either displays the date or the time. Whereas what I'd like to do is actually display the date and the time side by side. So what we're going to need to do is add in a custom formatting. And this is where things can get a little bit confusing if you've never worked with a custom date format. But essentially at this point in time, you can see a real demo of how this date is currently formatted. So it's got the day abbreviated to the first 3 letters. It's got the month also abbreviated, the date, the year, and also the time. So if we were to open up this custom formatting, I can see we've got 3 letters, which is a triple D. So that's our day, followed by the month, and so on. Now, what we're actually going to do is select all of this value here. We're going to highlight it and we're going to delete it. And that's because I'm going to paste in my own custom formatting. Now, if you want this format, I'd recommend pausing this tutorial here and then just manually copying this across. But of course, I'll walk you through this. So to start with, I've got 3 lowercase d's, which is my day. I then have the full display of my month. So I have 4 lowercase m's. Then from there, I have a space followed by 2 lowercase d's. So that is the actual date. Then I have a comma, and from there, I'm just displaying the time. So I've got 2 uppercase h's, a semicolon, and then 2 uppercase m's. Now, by all means, if this is too confusing for you, feel free to select one of the pre-existing options from the format types. But again, all you need to do is just pause this tutorial here and manually copy this across, and you'll have the exact same format that I'm going to be using today. I'm then going to choose to close this here because what I'd like to do is jump on down to the styling of this text element. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually update this font size. I'm going to set this to be 16, so it's slightly smaller. I'll also choose to unbold this text. However, I'd still like to increase the font weight of this text. So I'm going to open up this drop-down menu here and select from the 600 semi-bold choice. I'll also update the font color to be a shade of orange. If you'd like this color code, it's D1410C. And actually, to contradict myself, what I'm going to do is actually set the font size here to be 14, not 16. So that way it's even smaller there. And realistically, I don't need 20 pixels of margin at the top of this text element as it's being pushed down quite a bit. As you can see, there's quite a bit of space between both of these elements. So what I'm going to do is just jump over into my layout tab and update the top margin here to be 10, not 20. Now from here, what I'd like to do is add yet another text element into my white group. And in order to do that, I'm going to select my title once again. I'll make a copy of that. And I'd like to move this to the last position in my white group. So within my layout tab here, I can move this to the next position, and that's going to push it to the bottom of the group. I'll then jump into my appearance tab. And for this text element, I'd like this to display the parent group's event, the location of that event. And then beside this location, what I'd like to do is display the price of a ticket to this event. So what I'm going to do is select into my input field here. I will add in a space followed by a dash and then another space. And then I'm going to insert more dynamic data and I'm going to reference the parent group's event, the price of this event. Now, because that price is formatted as a number, what I'd like to do is update the formatting to show it as a currency. So I'm going to select the more option here and I can choose to format this as, and as I mentioned, by default, this is going to be a number, whereas I want this to be a currency. I'm then going to select my currency prefix. In this case, I'm going to use dollars. I'll also give this a 1,000 separator, just in case someone is charging over $1,000 for a ticket. It's just going to format that correctly. I can then choose to close this here, and that is all of the dynamic data I'll need to add in. While I'm working on this text element, I'm going to update the style of this. I'm going to set the font size to be 14. I will unselect that this should be bold, and I'll jump over to my layout tab, and I'm once again going to update the top margin to just be 10, not 20. But I won't need to change any of the additional responsive settings because of course they have been copied across when we made a duplicate version of our initial text element. Now from here, there's one last text element I'd like to add into our white group. So I'm going to make a copy of this text element we've just created. But at this point in time, I can see we're starting to run out of room on our page. So in order to expand our page down, I'm just going to quickly select on our overall page. So if you just click on the gray element here in the background, so this is our index page. I'm just going to jump to our layout tab and I'm going to update the minimum height within our UI builder here. And I could set that to be something like 1500 pixels. And of course, when you go to preview or publish your application, you could update that to be the appropriate size. But for now, I just need more space to work within. For that new text element though, I'm just going to select on this, jump over into our appearance tab. And in order to delete all of this dynamic data, I can right click into this field and I can choose to clear all of this. And what that's going to do is reset this value. And now what I'd like to display is the organizer of this event. So I'm going to choose to insert dynamic data and I'm going to reference the parent group's event, the organizer. Now, of course, the organizer is separate from the creator of this event. So the organizer could often be something like an actual organization who's putting this event on. So it's not always going to be the person who's created this event in our database. For the styling of this text element, I'm just going to choose to bold this. I'll then jump into my layout tab. And what I'm going to do is scroll on down to my margins, and I'm going to update the top margin to be 20. So I do want this to be slightly more spaced out from my previous text elements. I'll add in a bottom margin of 20 as well, and then I'm just going to keep my existing left and right margins as 10. But what you'll see is that because this is the very last element within my white group, it's going to make sure that it doesn't touch the border of the group itself. And now because that is the very last element I'd like to add into my white group, I'm going to select on the white group here. So this is my group event. I can jump to my layout tab, and what I'm going to do is set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around all of the text elements we've already added. And then while we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to add in some margin around this white group, because as you can see, it expands across the full width of my repeating group cell. So right now, all of my groups are touching, whereas that's not the experience I'd like to create. So I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border, and that's going to create a more tile-like experience similar to the real-world Eventbrite product. So that looks quite nice now. From here, we'll then just need to finalize the overall repeating group formatting. So if I select on the repeating group itself, so our repeating group event, I can now also update the minimum height to be 0. But of course, I also need to jump into our appearance tab, because I'll now need to set the minimum height to also be 0. And of course, that means it's going to collapse around all of the elements inside of it. And then finally, I would also like to set the minimum width of each column to be 320 pixels, because similar to our existing category repeating group, I want this to fit nicely on a mobile device. So if I jump to my responsive tab and select that I should be viewing this on the smallest possible mobile device, which is 320 pixels, I want one tile to fit in here perfectly. However, of course, when we expand our page, I want to display more tiles as the page becomes larger. And now at this point, that is the very last thing we'll need to add onto our homepage. I know we've spent so long building this page already, but there is just one last thing I want to take care of, and that is making sure that this page is entirely responsive across any device. So at this point in time, if we were to view this page on a desktop, it looks fantastic. Our hero image stretches out, our repeating groups are fully responsive. However, as we shrink this page size down, what you'll see is that the dimensions of this image become quite squished. And so in order to create a resolution for that, I'm just going to select on the image itself, and I'm going to jump to my layout tab. Now at this point in time, I can see that I have a minimum width of 0 for this image and a maximum width of infinite. So that means it's going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. But the problem I have here is that the height settings aren't actually linked to the width. So this image just knows that it can't be any higher than 400 pixels. So it's always going to be 400 pixels in height. And so if I was to select to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, it's going to tie the height in with my width. And if I set the aspect ratio to be 3:1, it's now going to automatically resize the height with the width at the same time. So as you'll see, when I shrink the page, the height of the image also shrinks with it. So that's how we can create a truly responsive experience for this element here. The only other thing I'd just like to point out is that at 320 pixels, so on the smallest possible mobile device, you'll just see that my search box is getting cut off. And the reason for this is because this search box here is currently trying to share space directly beside this text element as well. And there's obviously not enough space for both these elements on our page. And so if I was to actually give this element a minimum value, so let's say something like 280 pixels, what you'll see is that this search box now knows that it can't be any smaller than 280 pixels. So that means that if there's not enough space for both of these two elements on the one line, it's automatically going to break and collapse and display below it, which is the exact experience we want to create. Now, the reason why I have selected 280 pixels here is because we need to remember that the smallest possible device size that someone can use is going to be a phone at 320 pixels. And on our red group, we have a margin of 20 pixels on each side. So 320 minus 20 minus another 20 is 280. But what you'll also notice is that our search box is currently protruding our red group here. And that's because we still have this margin that we've added on it. So that way it could avoid touching the text element that sat beside it whenever the page was expanded out. So what I could do is actually create a condition on this search box and just recognize that when the page is, let's say, around about 480 pixels. So this looks like it's the size in which the search box breaks down onto our new line. What I could do is just recognize that when it breaks onto the separate line, I'd like to remove that margin. So in order to do that, we could jump to our conditional tab for our search box. And I could define a new condition and just type in the word width. And I'm going to recognize when the current page width is in fact less than 480 pixels. So I'm just going to type in the number 480. What I then like to do is type in the word left and select our left margin. And instead of this being 10, I'm going to set this to be 0. And now if I was to shrink my page down, what you'll see is that that margin is going to be removed. And when we view our device at 320 pixels, we now have this fully responsive experience where our search box fits perfectly. So at this point in time, this page is now completely responsive from top to bottom. And if we were to run a quick preview of this here, what you'll see is that this looks quite similar to the example I just shown you before when we ran a preview to view our categories. And the reason for that is because at this point in time, we have not yet built out the feature that allows us to actually create new events. So we don't have any events to display within our repeating group here. But of course, once we build out the feature to enable that, you'll start to see these being displayed right in front of your eyes on the core homepage. But for the time being, I just want to jump back into our Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the homepage, which in comparison to some of the other modules within our tutorial today, this was a huge section we had to cover. So please don't get overwhelmed if you're completely exhausted by this point. I feel like my voice box is about to break from having to speak for so long. But now that we've taken care of this huge section of our application, anything else we build is just going to add on top of that experience. So I'm super excited to jump into the rest of the features within our Notion checklist here today. Working our way through the list of features within our Notion checklist, the next thing I'd just like to cover is how we can build out a navigation menu. Now this is going to be an extension on top of our existing homepage we've already created. And of course, if I was to just open up the real-world Eventbrite product, you'll see that within their own navigation menu, they have a logo followed by a search field, as well as some additional options here that are positioned on the right-hand side. And there is a reason why I didn't build this out on the homepage within our first module, and that is because I wanted to break this down into its own specific section, because there's quite a few little nuances I'm going to teach you throughout this process, so I didn't want to overwhelm you in the beginning. But if we were to open up our bubble editor here and open our existing homepage that we've already created. Now, theoretically, if we wanted to build a navigation menu, so let's say we want to look at the real-world Eventbrite product once again. If I was to look at this navigation menu on the page, I can see that there's almost like one big group at the top of the page, and it would have a container layout set to be a row, and it would just stack all of these elements horizontally. So you wouldn't be entirely wrong if you thought that you could just add a simple group to the top of your page here and add all your elements into it to create one navigation menu. What I would like to do instead though today is actually not add a group onto this page, but instead build what's known as a reusable element. And now a reusable element, as the name would suggest, allows you to essentially just reuse an element more than once in your application. So to explain things in the most simple version possible, you can build the element once and then you can just reference it at any given point in time on any page of your app. So it'll save you having to rebuild it on every single page. Now that's perfect for our navigation menu because we're actually going to want to add this exact same menu across every single page we create today. Because of course, users will need to be able to jump between all of the different pages regardless of where they are. And so in Bubble, in order to build what's known as a reusable element, what you'll see is that if you open up your page drop-down menu here, you have this little option at the bottom, which is kind of hidden in a way, and it just allows you to create a reusable element. Now, if I just select on this, it's going to prompt me to give this element a name. So I'm going to call this my header menu. I'm going to choose to create this, and then it's going to redirect me through to a menu that kind of looks like its own separate page. But what we're actually building here is a standalone element. So if I was to double click on this reusable element here and jump to our appearance tab, what you'll see is that you have the option to select from one of 3 choices for this element. So is this element going to be a group? Is it going to be a pop-up? Or is it going to be a floating group? Now at this point in time, we haven't covered a pop-up or a floating group, and we don't need to know what they are right now, because this type of element is essentially going to be a group. So when you're building this element here, just pretend you're working inside of a group that sits on your page. So whatever we build here, we're essentially going to drag that onto our page in a moment. Now, like any group element, the first thing I'd like to do is make this fully responsive. So I'm going to jump over into my layout tab, and I'm going to update the container layout. Now, because I'd like to display elements horizontally across our page, I'm going to set the container layout here to be a row. Then from here, I'll need to make this element fully responsive. And this is where things can slightly differ from the traditional settings you've seen when we've worked with groups up to this point in our tutorial. So at this point, this element is in fact fully responsive. It has a minimum width of 0 and a maximum width of infinite. So if I was to jump over into my responsive tab, I'd see that this group would expand out and retract regardless of whatever size a user's browser is. However, within our UI builder, the group is still quite small. And that's because we have the ability to also customize the size of how this is displayed within this little builder here. And so you can see that the width is currently set to 200. Whereas if I was to set this to be something like 960, and the reason why I'm selecting 960 is because that's roughly the size of a very small browser. This just gives me more of a realistic size as to how our navigation menu is going to look and feel. Now we'll come back and update the height of this in a moment, but before we do that, I'd like to add all of my elements into this group. And so if we just quickly jump over to the real-world Eventbrite product, what you'll see is that within our header menu, of course, all of our elements are positioned horizontally across the page. However, you can kind of see that this group is broken into 2 different sections. So if we were to draw a line down the middle of our page here, you'll see on the left-hand side, there's our logo and our search field. And then on the right-hand side, there's all of these additional icons and page selection menus. And so when I look at this overall page, I not only see the overall group for our header menu, but inside of that, I see 2 additional groups. So one for the left-hand side and one for the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is replicate this within our bubble editor by first of all, heading to our containers menu, and I'm going to add a group element into our reusable element. So I guess I have a group inside of my group. Now, before I make any changes, I'm going to update this group here to be called group left. And similar to what I previously worked with groups, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm going to remove the default style of this because I'd like to give this background style a flat color. And I'm going to set this to be a light shade of, let's say, green. And the reason for that is because it's just going to allow me to see where this sits on my page. What I'm then going to do is make a copy of this group. However, the first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this, and I'm going to call this group right, because this is going to be the group on the right-hand side of my page. I'll then jump to my background style, and I'll update the color of this to be a light shade of red. So now I can easily see where these 2 groups lie within my overall white group. Now, what I'd also like to do is make these 2 groups fully responsive. So if I start by selecting on my green group here, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and I'll update the container layout to be a row because I'll be stacking elements in this side by side. I'll then unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. And as you probably guessed by now, I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. Then I'm going to do the exact same thing for my group right. So I'm going to select on my red group. I'll update the container layout to be a row. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now both of these groups are going to take up as much space as they can within our overall white group. So they're going to share this space evenly. Now from here, what we're going to do is build out all of the elements that are displayed within our green group. So the very first element was going to be the Eventbrite logo. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm just going to grab an image and I'm going to upload a static image. Now I'm going to be uploading an image from my local device here, but of course I've also uploaded that into the Google Drive, which I've already shared a link with you. So that way you can download that and follow along and upload the exact same image I'm using. And so once I've uploaded an image, what I'm then going to do is update the dimensions of this. So I'll jump to my layout tab here. And when it comes to the width of this image, I'm going to set the width as 130 pixels. But I'm also going to select to keep this element aspect ratio fixed. Now, if I set this as a 4:1 ratio, it's going to rescale this image appropriately. And of course, I'm going to leave this width as a fixed value here because I don't want it to be fully responsive. I don't want it to scale up or scale down. I only ever want it to be this exact size here. I'll then choose to vertically align this image in the center of my green group. And then finally, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, and 20 on the left. But I won't add any on the right because beside this, I'd like to now add in an input field. Now, instead of actually adding a search box into this green group, what we're actually going to do is create a group that looks like a search box to give the illusion that someone is going to click into an input field and type into it. Only later on throughout our build today, whenever someone clicks on that group, it's going to drop down an additional menu from which they can type in a particular search query. And trust me, that'll make a lot more sense when we get to that module in our tutorial. However, in order to replicate that search box, I'm going to grab a group element from our containers menu. And I'm going to first of all update the name of this group to be called group search. Because later on in our tutorial, we're going to trigger a workflow whenever this group is clicked. So I just want to easily be able to identify what the name of this group is. I'll then jump over to my appearance tab quickly because I'd like to detach the style of this. And I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color and I'll leave that as white for now. I'll then jump into my layout tab here. And when it comes to this group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. Now, I'm only going to be adding one element into this group. So it doesn't really matter if you select from a row or a column. But again, I just like columns personally, so I'm going to select that option. Then from here, we're going to head on down to our width settings and I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width here to be 0. Only this time, I'm going to set the maximum width to be 400. So that just means that as my page expands and scales up accordingly, this group will be no larger than 400 pixels. So once it reaches 400 pixels, it will no longer expand out any further. And that is the exact experience I want to create today. I don't want this search field to continually just expand out because it just look quite silly if it took up too much space. So I'm just going to set the maximum width as 400. Now 400 is purely just a random number I've selected. I think that's the right width that will suit this particular group. But what I'll also need to do is update the height of this because obviously this group is quite large. Before we do that though, we'll need to add our text element into this group. So if we jump back to our UI builder here, I'm going to add a text element into this group. And for this text element, I'm just going to have this display the words search events ... I'll then jump down to my styling for this text element, and I'm just going to update the color here to be a light shade of gray. If you'd like that color code, it's 808080. I'll then jump into my layout tab because I'd like to make this element fully responsive. And of course, that means I'm going to need to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. I'll also update the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to wrap nicely around that text. I'll then also add in 20 pixels of margin on the left. So that way this text element doesn't touch the left border of my white group. And what you might notice is that within my layout tab, I don't have the ability to vertically align this element in the center of my white group. However, if I was to select on the white group itself, you'll see we have this option to update the container alignment. Now, the container alignment just refers to the position of elements inside of this group. So a group is also known as a container because it obviously contains different elements inside of it. So if I vertically align all of the elements in the center of this group, this text element will now be positioned directly where we want it. Finally, I can then select on my group, jump to our layout tab, and for the minimum height here, I'm not actually going to set this to be 0 because if I did, what you'd notice is that it's going to collapse around the text element. Whereas I actually want this group to look like a search field. And if you remember, the height of a search box was 48 pixels. And how do I know that? Because if you were to jump to your inputs, you could grab a search box here, add this in, head to your layout tab, and you'll see that the height is 48 pixels. So I want this white group to look exactly like a search field. So I'm going to set this to be 48 pixels as well. I'll then select on my white group and vertically align this in the center of my green group. And then finally, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this white group. And just like that, you can see that our left-hand group has come together quite nicely. So what I'm actually going to do now is select on the overall green group here, jump to my layout tab, and I'm just going to update the minimum height of this group to be 0. That means that it will collapse around all of the elements inside of it. and I can then vertically align this in the center of my overall white reusable element. And it's at this point in time that you can finally start to see that our header menu is coming together nicely. So on the right hand side here, what we'll need to do is build out the additional options. And now just when you thought we were starting to make linear progress, I'm going to throw another curveball into the mix. If we jump over into the real world Eventbrite product, what you'll see is that this menu here displays a series of icons as well as my profile photo. However, it's displaying this because we're actually logged into an account. If I was to log out of this account here, what you'll actually notice is that this menu changes. And something I just want to point out is the two options here to either log in or sign up to an account. So what I'm actually going to do today is create two separate menus that will display on the right hand side of our header menu. The first will be displayed to users who are not logged in which case it's going to display these two options to either log in or sign up. And then once someone has logged in, I'm going to hide that menu and display our second option, which is going to be all of those icons which allow someone to navigate between the different pages in our application. And so if we jump back into our bubble editor, what I'm going to do is add two text elements into this red group. So I'm going to scroll on up to our visual elements and add a text element here. And this very first text element is going to display the words log in. Now for this text element, I'm going to update the font size here to be 16. I'm also going to choose to bold this text. And finally, I'll also align this text in the center of the element as well. I can then jump over to our layout tab because of course I'd like to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. But what I'm actually going to do here is select the option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So I actually want this element to collapse around both of the words inside of this text element. For the height, I'll then set this to be 0, so that way it also collapses around this text element. I can then vertically align this element in the center of our red group. And from here, I'll add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, and 20 on the left. I'm then going to want to copy this text element. So I'm going to select on this, hit Command C, select in my red group, and paste in another version. Only this time, I'm going to update this to display the words sign up. Because of course, when someone clicks this, I'd like them to actually sign up to a new account. Now, the only other change we'll need to make for this particular text element is within our layout tab. Because this is the very last element that's positioned in this red group, I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the right hand side. And then from here, I'm going to select on the red group itself. I'll jump to my layout tab and I'll update the minimum height here to be 0. So that way it's now going to collapse around both of our text elements inside of it. And then while we're here, I'm also going to update the width settings once again. I'm actually going to select this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. Because when you think about it, this red group here doesn't actually need much space on my page. It only needs to display these two elements. So it's pointless in it taking up so much additional space when it only needs this small caveat of my overall header menu. The last thing I will need to do though is just vertically align this in the center of my overall reusable element. So that way it's perfectly in line with our existing green group. Now from here, I'd also like to create an additional group that's going to display on the right hand side once a user has in fact logged into an account. And so we're actually going to build that group from scratch. So if we head to our containers menu and add another group element into our existing white reusable element, I'm going to update the name of this to be called group right logged in. So this is the group that's going to display to someone once they've logged into their account, which means I should also select on my existing red group here and update the name of this to be called group right logged out. Because of course, this is the group that's going to display when someone is not logged into their account. From here, I'm just going to select on our second group. So this is our group right logged in. I'll jump to my appearance tab and I'll just detach the style of this because of course I'd like to give this a flat background color. And I can set that to be, let's say, a light shade of blue, just so I can easily differentiate this from the existing groups in my overall reusable element. I'll then jump to my layout tab. I'll set the container layout of this to be a row. And the reason for that is because I'd like to stack elements in this horizontally, so side by side. Now inside of this group, I'm going to add in a series of icons which will also have a text heading below them. Because if I was to jump over into the real world Eventbrite product and log into my existing account, what you'll see is that as I've just described, we have a series of almost like separate groups here, which inside of those, they have elements stacked vertically, so from top to bottom. And on the top, we have an icon, and below that, we have a text element. And in order to do that, we're going to add a series of groups into this blue group here. And if you find that you're running out of space at this point in time, what you can always do is open up what's known as your elements tree. And you can choose to display all of the elements on your page. And if you just select this little eye icon next to an element, it will either hide or display those elements on your page as well. So we're going to head on down to our containers menu and add yet another group inside of our existing group here. Now for this group, the first thing I'd like to do is actually update the name of this, just so that way I can easily tell it apart when I build out some workflows in the future. So I'm going to call this group the Create Event group. So if I was to look on the real world Eventbrite product, this is going to be the group displayed here with your little plus icon as well as the text Create an Event. So if I jump into Bubble, I'll head over to my Appearance tab, and of course I'm just going to detach the style of this so I can give it a flat background color. Now while I'm working on this group, I'll set this color to be red, just so that way I can see where it sits inside of my overall blue group. I'll then jump over into my Layout tab. And for the container layout of this group, because both of these elements are stacked on top of each other, we'll need to set the container layout to be a column. Now that's why we're actually adding these groups into our existing blue group. It's because they're going to have a different container layout to the overall group that they sit inside of. So this is just going to give us more control over how we actually position our elements. Now for this group, we're going to need to make it fully responsive. So for the time being, we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, and we will set the minimum width to be 0, and of course leave the maximum width as infinite. We are going to come back to our Layout tab in a moment and update some additional settings. Before we do that though, I'd just like to build out the elements that are going to display inside of this group. And so the very first element is going to be an icon. So if we head to our visual elements here, I'm going to grab an icon element and add it into our red group. And for this icon, I'm just going to type in the word plus, and I'll select from this plus icon. After selecting the icon, I'm also going to update the color of this. I just have a custom blue color code that I'm going to use. If you'd like that, it's 3659E3. I'm then going to jump into our Layout tab, because what I'd like to do is horizontally align this icon in the center of our group. Now, when it comes to the actual width and height of this icon, I'm going to leave this as the default options. I'm quite happy with it being 30 pixels by 30 pixels. And these are both fixed values, which means that this icon will always be this exact size you see here. No greater and no smaller. I'll then jump back to my visual elements. I'll add a text element below this icon. And this text element will display the words Create an Event. Now for the styling of this text element, I'm going to leave the font size as is. However, I will update the font color to be the same blue color code I've just used on my icon. So if you'd like that, it's 3659E3. I'm also going to choose to bold this text and center align it in the actual element itself. I'll then jump to my Layout tab, and we'll need to make this element fully responsive. So what we're going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. We will set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And then from here, I'm also going to set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around the text inside of it. And I won't need to worry about adding any margin to this element. But thankfully, that's all we'll need to add into this red group. So if I select on the red group itself, so this is our group Create Event. I'm going to now head to its Layout tab and update the minimum height to also be 0. And that of course means it's going to collapse nicely around both of these elements. However, I can see that on both sides of these elements, there's still quite a bit of empty space. So if I was to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it, it's also going to collapse around all of those elements inside of it on both sides. So now this kind of looks more like a button, which is the exact experience we want to create. And look, thankfully the process of building out all of the additional groups is going to be relatively straightforward, because at this point we can just copy and paste this existing red group and just swap out the icon as well as the text element. So if I was to make a copy of this red group and paste it into my existing blue group, the next heading menu I'd like to display is actually going to be a way for someone to manage any existing events that they've already created. And so what I'm going to do is first of all update the title of this group, and I'm going to call this group Manage. Then from here, all we need to do is update the icon. So for this icon, I'm going to jump to my Appearance tab, and I'm just going to type in the word pencil. And I'm going to grab this little pencil icon here. And for this icon, I'm also going to update the color of this. Because what you'll notice is that on the real world Eventbrite product, it's only the icon and text for the Create an Event option that is blue. The rest of the options are black. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add in a custom black color code here, which if you'd like that, it's 44454A. And then finally, I'm also going to update the text that's displayed inside of this text element. I'm going to have this just display the word manage. And I'll also head on down to the color of this text element and make that the exact same black color code as the icon above it. And that's all I'll need to change for both of these elements here. What I would like to do though is add some margin around this overall red group, because at this point in time, you can see it's touching my existing group to the left-hand side. So if I jump to my layout tab, what I'm going to do is add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the bottom, 20 on the left. I won't add any on the right for now, because I do still want to add an additional group to the right-hand side of this existing group. But what I'd also like to do is select on my first red group and add the exact same margins into this. So if I select our layout tab, I'm going to add in 20 at the top, 20 on the bottom, and 20 on the left. And now you can really start to see that this section of our menu is coming together quite nicely. To finalize this section, I'm just going to select on our second group here, and I'm going to make a copy of this. Now, because there's not enough space for this, it's going to be positioned below on a separate line, but we'll come back and fix that in a moment. What I'm interested in doing for now, though, is just updating, first of all, the name of this group. So I'm going to call this group Tickets. So when someone clicks on this group, it's going to take them through to a page where they can view a list of all of the tickets that they've purchased. And we'll build out that workflow in a moment. But what I'll first do is update the icon that's displayed inside of this group. So if we jump to our Appearance tab here, I'm just going to open up the icon library and type in the word ticket and select from the only icon. Then I'll jump to the text here and have this display the word tickets. And because this is the very last group inside of our overall blue group, I will jump to my layout tab. I'll select on the red group itself. And if I scroll on down, I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin on the right hand side. So that way it won't touch the border of my overall blue group. Now from here, I can select on the blue group itself and I'll update the final responsive settings for this. Then after making changes to all of the elements in this red group, there is one last thing I'd like to add into our blue group here, and that is just going to be a user's profile photo. So that way when someone clicks on this, they can be sent through to their own settings page, in which case they can then view and edit the details of their profile. So in order to display someone's profile photo, we're going to head on over to our visual elements and we're going to grab an image element. We'll add this into our blue group. And when it comes to this image, the first thing we'll need to do is give it a dynamic data source. Because in this case, we'd like to display the profile photo of the current user. So that information will be stored in our database. So in order to do that, we're going to insert dynamic data into the dynamic image field. And I'd like to display the current user. So the current user is the person who is logged in and is currently viewing their own account. And in this case, I'd just like to display their profile photo. Now, if you remember, by default in our database, we had set a profile photo for every user. So if we went to our user data type here, you might remember that under our profile photo, we'd taken the time to upload the default profile photo image. So even if a user has not taken the time to upload a custom profile photo, this is the image that would be displayed. But of course, if someone has taken the time to change their own profile photo, that new image would overwrite this existing one, and that is the image that would be displayed instead. So if we just jump back into our design tab, after configuring this data source here, what I'd also like to do when I'm working with most images is just select this more option, so that way I can choose to process these with ImgX. And I'd just like to resize the dimensions by cropping it, so that way the image fits perfectly in the space that we allocate. I'm then going to choose to close this here. I'm going to head on down to the style and I'm going to choose to detach this style, because what I'd like to do is add a solid border around this image, so that way I can actually see where it sits on my page. And I'm also going to update the roundness of this border to be 100. So that way it will become a perfect circle. Then from here, we can jump over to our layout tab, because we'll need to update the dimensions of this image. And so when it comes to the width of this image, I'm going to set this to be 50 pixels. And I am going to keep this as a fixed value. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed at a 1:1 ratio, which now means that it's 50 pixels by 50 pixels. So now it is a perfect square. I'm also then just going to add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this image. And I'm going to select this option to make it the very last element within my blue group. Now, what you might notice at this point is that because we don't have enough space to fit all of my elements in one single line, this image is being collapsed down to a new line. And thankfully, there is an easy solution for this. So what we need to remember is that our group here on the right, so our red group, is only going to be displayed when users are not logged into their account. Whereas all the elements in our blue group are only going to be displayed once someone is logged into their account. So we're actually only going to display one of these groups at a time. There will be no point in time where both of these groups are visible to a user. And so in order to create that experience, I'm now going to show you how we can actually hide and display certain groups. So if I was to double click on my red group here, so this is my group right logged out. What I'm going to first do is unselect that this element should be visible on page load, which means that by default, it will not be displayed. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this when it's hidden. And that way what you'll see is that when this group is no longer visible, it won't take up any space on our page. But of course, because this group is hidden by default, I'm going to need to create some sort of way to recognize when it should be shown to our end users. So if we jump to our conditional tab, we can create a brand new condition from scratch. And if you're relatively new to Bubble, conditions are just a way of recognizing when a behavior is true. And so in this case, I'd just like to recognize when the user is logged out. I'd like to actually display this group. So what we could do is define a condition and just recognize when the current user is logged out. So that means they're not signed into an account. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. What I also love about conditions is that you can choose to toggle these on and off to see what that would look like. I'm then going to need to create the exact same experience for our blue group. So I'm going to jump to my blue group here. I'm going to head to my layout tab. And similar to before, I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'll also choose to collapse this element. And then I'm going to jump over to our conditional tab and I'm going to define a condition. Only this time I'm going to recognize when the current user is logged in which case I'd like to select that this element should be visible and I will tick that that should be true. Now I can also see that we're going to need to still update the layout settings for this blue group. But before we do that, I'm just going to choose to hide this red group here. Now, another way of being able to hide and display elements is if you jump over to your elements tree, what this is going to do is display a list of all of the elements on your page. So you can see here I have all of my different groups. And if you were to select this little eye icon, it will either toggle them on and off. So it will hide them or display them. So I'm just going to toggle off my group logged out. So that way I'm only viewing my group logged in at this point in time. I'm then going to click on my blue group, jump to my layout tab. Then I'm going to head on down to the width settings for this group. I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0. I'll leave the maximum width as infinite. However, I am going to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. So now it's going to collapse nicely around all of the elements that sit inside the blue group. I'll then scroll on down to my height, and I'd like to set the minimum height to also be 0. And that's now going to collapse around the elements as well. And then finally, I'd like to vertically align this overall group in the center of my navigation menu. And so at this point in time, everything now aligns perfectly. And this is where you can really start to see our navigation menu coming together quite nicely. Now, in order to actually power our navigation menu, we're going to need to make this functional. So when a user clicks on one of these 4 options here, we should be sending them to a certain page within our app. And thankfully, this is a super straightforward process to do. In order to create this experience, we're going to start by selecting the very first red group. So this is the group create event. And now what I'm going to do is jump to my appearance tab, scroll on up, and we're going to create our very first workflow. So workflows in Bubble are just a way of actually making your application functional. So this is where we can visually create certain processes that are going to happen. And then on the back end, Bubble's going to take care of writing all of that in custom code. But of course, we don't need to see any of that. We're only here to build things visually today. So I'm going to select on this red group and I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever this is clicked. Then inside of this workflow, it's a relatively straightforward process. I'd just like to send someone through to a page where they could create a new event. So I'm going to select to add a new action within my workflow. I'm going to select from our navigation tab and I'll choose the go to page action. So we're going to be sending someone through to a destination page. Now at this point in time, our destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to have to create a brand new page from scratch here. And for this page, I'm going to call this the create page because this is where someone's going to be creating a new event. So I'll select to create this. Then if I was to open up my drop-down menu again, you would see that we can now select that as a destination page. And that is all we'll need to build out for this workflow. It is super straightforward. We don't need to worry about sending any data through to this page at this point in time. However, I will be explaining that in a later point in our tutorial today. The only other personal recommendation I'd give right now is that if we were to select on our workflow trigger here, I just like to color code my workflows based on the features that they belong to. So if I was to set the event color of this workflow to be red, what I could do is just recognize that any other workflows that are navigation events in our reusable element, they could all share the same color code. So that way I know they're related to the same feature. From here though, we're going to just jump back to our design tab. We're going to select on our next group, which is our manage group. I'm going to choose to start a workflow whenever someone clicks on this. And within this workflow, we're going to create the exact same experience. So I'm going to choose to add an action. We'll select from the navigation events, choose the go to page action, and the destination page, once again, it does not yet exist. So we're going to create a brand new page here. I'll call this the manage page. We'll create this. I'll then open up my page drop-down menu and select that that is the destination page. I'll click on my workflow trigger and update the event color here to be red. So that way I can easily tell that this is a navigation event. We'll then jump back to our design tab and do the exact same thing for our tickets group. So I'm going to choose to start a workflow, head to our navigation events, select the go to page action. Once again, the destination page does not yet exist. So we're going to create a brand new page from scratch, and we're going to be calling this the tickets page. I will create this. I'll select that as my destination page. And then finally, I'll select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be red. And from here, there's one last workflow we'll need to build, and that is when our profile photo is clicked. So I'm going to select on this, start a new workflow. We'll head to the navigation events, choose the go to page action, and I'll set the destination page here to be our settings page, which we have not yet created. So I'm going to choose to create a brand new page from scratch. I'll call this our settings page. We'll create that. Then we can open up our page drop-down menu and select that that should be the destination page. And then finally, we're going to select on our workflow trigger and update the event color here to be red. And just like that, that is how you can build out all of the workflows to make this section of our reusable element functional. Now, of course, we also need to remember that within our overall header menu, we're going to have a search bar as well as some workflows that are going to need to run whenever someone wants to log in or sign up for our app. But we're going to build all of those workflows in separate sections of our tutorial today. We don't need to focus on those right now. What I would like to do though is just finish building off our reusable element. So at this point in time, I can see we've got all of this empty space above and below our main elements. So if I was to click on the overall reusable element, so this is our header menu. What I'm going to do is jump to our layout tab, and under the minimum height setting, I'm going to set this to be 0, which means it's now going to collapse nicely around all of the elements inside of it. And just like that, you can see that this overall heading has come together perfectly. Obviously, it looks like a big rainbow cake right now, given all of the different colors we have in this. But of course, you can update those when you go to preview or publish your app. The very last thing I just wanted to touch base on when it comes to our reusable element here is how we can actually make this element fully responsive. So if this header menu is going to sit at the top of every single page in our application, we need to make sure it is a fully responsive experience. And if we were to jump into our responsive tab right now, and if we were to just hide our logged out group and display our logged in group, obviously this is going to look great when we stretch this out across the full width of a desktop browser. However, when we start to shrink this down on a mobile device, what you'll see is that all of the elements will become squished, and it just doesn't really create a nice end user experience. And so what I'd love to do is just show you the step-by-step process that I personally use in order to make something like this fully responsive. And the way we can do this is by creating what's known as breakpoints using conditions. And now I know that's going to sound very overwhelming if you're brand new to Bubble, but of course it's my job to show you some real world examples here so that way you can completely understand that concept. So the best way to understand this is by actually just reducing the width of this overall reusable element. And if I was to look at the size right now, I'm quite happy with how everything looks. It's only when I start to reduce things to around about this size here that I'm noticing that my search box is becoming quite small. And it's roughly about at this point in time that I think that this search box should take up more space. It shouldn't be this small. And so perhaps what I could do is choose to hide our Eventbrite logo, which would then mean that our search box has more space to take up inside of our overall green group. And so if I was to look at the current page dimensions, right now I can see the page is 739 pixels in width. And it's at this point in time that I would obviously like to hide this Eventbrite logo. So what I could actually do is select on this image element. I could jump over to my layout tab and I could create a condition. And within that condition, I could just recognize when the current page width is less than 740 pixels. So when it's 739 pixels, what I'd like to do is actually hide this element. So if I was to define a condition here, I'm just going to type in the word width, and I'm going to recognize when the current page width is less than 740 pixels. What I'm then going to do is select that this element should be visible and untick that should be true. So now it's going to be hidden. But of course, at this point in time, the element is hidden, but it's still taking up space inside of my green group. So if I jump over into my layout tab, I can select this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, which now means that when it's not being displayed, it's not going to take up any space inside of my group. So you can now see that our search bar is going to take up all of that remaining space. And so that gives us some additional room right now at this current size. But of course, what's going to happen when we start to reduce the width of our page even more? As you'll see, when we start to reduce our page below the 600 pixel mark, once again, my search field is becoming quite narrow. But as this header menu reduces in size, I'd actually like to keep my search box as well as my profile photo visible, which means that I could potentially hide the rest of our elements here. So I could just create a condition on these three red groups and recognize when the current page width is below 590 pixels, I could actually choose to hide these groups. So if I select on our very first red group here, so this is going to be our group tickets. I'm going to head to our conditional tab, I'll define a condition, and I'll type in the word width. And I'm going to recognize when the current page width is less than 590 pixels. What I'll then do is select that this element should be visible and untick that should be true. Then of course I'll need to jump to my layout tab and I'll need to select this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. And of course, as you'll see, that element will no longer be displayed and our search bar has more room to display itself within our menu. Now from here, we'll just need to replicate that exact same condition across the two remaining groups. And in order to streamline that process, we can jump to our conditional tab for our group tickets. We can right click here and we can choose to actually copy this condition. I can then select on my second group. So this is our group manage. I will then right click in our conditional tab and paste in the exact same condition. So that's going to save us having to rebuild that from scratch. However, I will still need to jump over to my layout tab and choose to collapse this element when it's hidden. And then we can do the exact same thing for our group create event. I'm going to jump to our conditional tab. I will right click and I'll choose to paste in that condition. I'll then jump to my layout tab and I will select to collapse this element when it's hidden. And then as we start to reduce the width of our header menu once again, and if we make it to the smallest possible mobile device size, which is 320 pixels, you'll see that only these two elements are left within the menu itself. But of course, as we continue to scale this menu up, all of these elements will become visible once again, as those conditions would no longer be true because the page isn't below a certain width. But that is how you can create a truly responsive header menu. And look, to be honest, the same applies when you're creating most responsive experiences in Bubble. What you'll find is that you just often need to create a series of conditions that will either hide and display certain elements, just so you can work around those based on the user's browser size. And look, as I promised, that was the very last thing I wanted to touch base on within this header menu. I know it seemed like a lot of work to create one very simple element, but that being said, this element's going to be displayed on every single page in our application. So it's super important that we get this right from the beginning. The very last thing we'll need to do is, of course, actually just add this onto our page. So we're going to head up to our page drop-down menu here, and then we're going to jump over to our index page. So this is the home page we had already created. Now, in order to display that header menu on this page, it's a super straightforward process. I'm just going to move my head out of the way here. And we're going to scroll right down to the very bottom of our elements tree. And at the bottom of this, you'll see a menu that displays reusable elements. And we can see our new header menu inside of this. What I'm going to do is select on this, head to the top of our page and click to add this in at the very top. And what you'll notice at the top of our page is that it's displaying the entire element here. Now, one thing I should point out is that you won't be able to actually make changes to this element inside of this page. This reusable element is just showing a preview of what this element looks like within that dedicated page that we had just edited. So if you ever want to make changes to anything inside of this element, you'll need to open up your page drop-down menu and head back to the reusable element itself and make any changes directly here. But of course, any changes you make will automatically be displayed in real time on any page that references this element. And so if I was to also just run a quick preview of my application here, what you'll see is that at the top of my page, our navigation menu is being displayed. And because I'm currently not logged into a user's account, the appropriate menu is being shown to me. And of course, it's going to prompt me to either log in or sign up to an account. And they are features we're going to build out in a moment. For the time being though, I just wanted to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out all of the features for our navigation menu. And look, I completely understand that there was quite a bit involved within this process, but thankfully, because we built this menu as a reusable element, we never have to build it again. We can simply just drag and drop a version of it onto any page that we want. Moving down our list of features within our Notion checklist here, I actually just wanted to quickly skip ahead and focus on a really important feature within our build today. And that's going to be the ability to allow users to create and publish new events within our Eventbrite app. Now I hope you're ready because this module is going to be huge. There's quite a few specific steps that I need to cover in depth when we actually go to create this feature. And of course, it's my job to make this as easy as possible for you to understand. So I'm going to make sure that I don't spare any of the juicy details throughout the process. Let's just jump into our bubble editor and we can get started. Over in our editor, the very first thing I'm going to do is open up our page drop-down menu here. And you may remember that at this point in time, we've already created our create page. However, of course, this page is currently blank. There's nothing on it. And so what we'll need to do is similar to any other page that we create inside of our application is just take care of a little bit of housekeeping before we can build out all of the core elements that are going to power this page. And so if I was to double click on the page itself and open up our property editor, the first thing I'm going to do is just update the background color of this page. Now I'm going to set this to be a light shade of gray, so that way I can see where the actual page sits within my bubble editor. So for the background color, I'm just going to set this to be a color which is F7, 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 and that'll give me a shade of gray. I'll also need to jump over to my layout tab, because I'll need to update the container layout of this page. Now, similar to every other page, because we're going to be stacking elements from the top down, that means we'll need to set the container layout as a column. And then from here, the last bit of housekeeping we'll need to take care of is just adding our reusable header menu to the top of this page. So if we just drag my head out of the way there and scroll right down to our reusable elements, we can grab our header menu and just add that in. And once again, that's going to save us a whole lot of time having to rebuild this from scratch on every single page. So we can easily just leverage all of the hard work we've already done when it came to actually building this navigation menu out. And just like that, we now have everything in place for us to go ahead and build out the rest of our page. And so when it comes to the process of creating a new event, I actually want to break this down into a couple of different stages, just so that way we can replicate the real-world Eventbrite product. And just for the first stage of this experience, I want a user to be able to add in some basic details about the event itself. So things like what the title is going to be, where the location is, what time it'll be on, and also who the organizer is for the event. And so instead of just adding a series of input fields directly onto my page, I'm actually going to put these into a group. And later on, I'm going to actually choose to hide and display groups based on where someone is throughout the process of creating that event. But of course, I'll touch base on that in more detail in a moment. What I'd like to do for now though is just head to our containers menu and grab a group element. And I'm going to add this onto my page. Now, when it comes to this group, the very first thing I'm going to do is actually update the title of this. I'm going to call this group step 1. So this is the group that's automatically going to display on this page by default as soon as someone opens up the create page. And within this group, as I mentioned, it's going to prompt a user to add in the most basic details about the event. And now when it comes to this group, I'm just going to jump to my appearance tab because I just like to detach the style of this. I'm going to scroll on down to my background style and give it a flat background color. And I'll leave this as white. I'll then jump to my layout tab because I'd like to also update the container layout of this group and then make this element fully responsive. So when it comes to this group, I'm going to be stacking elements from top to bottom, so vertically, which of course means that I need to set my container layout to be a column. I'll then head on down to my width settings and unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. So obviously this is going to take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. Now I will come back and update the height and the margin settings later on, but before I do that, I'd like to add all of the elements we need to display within this group. And the very first element is actually going to be a heading. And within that heading, we're not only going to display text, but we're also going to display an icon. So if we head to our visual elements, we're going to grab a text element here. Now, this is a little bit of a trick if you are relatively new to Bubble and you want to be able to add icons directly inside of your text element. So instead of having to grab a separate icon element and place that beside your text element, this is actually just going to save you a whole lot of time by actually combining these two together. And the way we're going to do this is by using some custom HTML code. Now, thankfully, you don't need to have any experience with HTML in order to do this. It's not very complex at all. And of course, I'm going to hold your hand throughout the whole process. So all we're going to do is open up a little open bracket here. So this is a square bracket. We're then going to type in the letters F and A followed by a closed square bracket. Then within this bracket, we will need to add the name of the icon that we would like to display. And if you didn't know where to source this name from, what you could do is actually grab an icon, add it onto your group, and when you select an icon, you'll see its name up the top here. Now, the icon I'm looking for is going to be this text icon here. So it's this page with a solid border around it, but a transparent inside. Now, if I was to just grab all of the text after the letters FA here, so in this case, it's file-text.o. What I'm going to do is copy that because that is the name of the icon I would like to reference. I'm then going to select back into my text element, and beside my closed square bracket, I'm going to paste the name of that icon in. I'm then going to close off the HTML formatting by adding another open square bracket, a /, followed by the letters FA once again, and then another closed square bracket. And what you'll now see is that our text has formatted as an icon, and that is as complex as it's going to get. So again, you didn't really have to know how to use HTML code, you just need to know where to put the right formatting in the right place. After this though, I'm going to add in a space, because I'm going to type in the words basic info, and that's going to be my main heading. I'm also just going to quickly delete this existing icon here, and then we can update the styling for this heading. And in the case of this particular text element, I'd like to update the size of this text to be 30. I'm going to bold this, and then I'm going to jump to my layout tab, because of course I'll need to make this text element fully responsive. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. Like always, as you probably guessed, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'm also going to update the minimum height to be 0, and because we have this option selected by default to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around the text. And then finally, I'll just add some margin around this text element. So I'm going to add in 30 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left, and 30 on the right. And that's just going to add some nice spacing around this element inside of my white group. Now below this, I'd like to add another text element, which is just going to be a short description of all the information that someone has to add into the fields in this group. So I'm going to grab another text element here, and within this element, I'm just going to paste in some pre-written text that I've sourced from the real-world Eventbrite product. If you'd like to use this exact same text, it just says the words, name your event and tell event goers why they should come. Add details that highlight what makes it unique. Now, when it comes to the styling of this element, I'm not going to update the font size. However, I will just update the font weight. I'm going to set this to be 500, so it's medium, and that's just going to slightly darken the actual font itself. I will, of course, need to make this element fully responsive though, so I'm going to jump to my layout tab. I will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll also set my minimum height to be 0. And then finally, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left, and 30 on the right. And that's going to ensure that it's in line with the existing text element that sits above it. Now, below this text element, I'd like to add in an input field, which is going to store the title for this event. So I'm just going to scroll on down to my input forms, grab an input field here, and before I make any changes to this input, what I'm going to do is take the time to update the name of this. I'm going to call this input title, so that way when we build out a workflow in a moment to actually create a new event, I know exactly which input field I need to reference. I'll also update the placeholder text that's displayed inside of this input. I'm going to have this display the words event title. Now we'll just need to remember that placeholder text only temporarily sits in this input field until a user clicks in it, and then that text is going to disappear. And that is the exact experience I'm looking to create today. From here though, we'll just jump to our layout tab because we'll need to update the responsive settings for this input field. So for the width, I'm going to unselect that should be a fixed width. As you probably guessed, the minimum width will be 0. Only in this instance, I'm not going to leave the maximum width as infinite, because right now it takes up the entire width of our group. Instead, I'm actually going to set the maximum width to be 600 pixels. And the reason for selecting this value is because I think that's enough space to add in the title of an event. But by all means, if you wanted to make this any longer or shorter, feel free to change this value here. When it comes to the height, I'm going to leave that as a fixed value at 48 pixels because I don't want this element to expand down. I'm always going to want it to be this exact height. But the only other thing I will change is the margins. I'm going to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left and 30 on the right. Now I can also see that the text element that sits above this input field is currently positioned a little bit further out to the right than the input itself. So what I could do is select on this text element, and I could also update its maximum width to be 600 pixels, which means it's now going to be perfectly in line with the input field below it. And that's just going to collapse the remaining text to a new line. So that just looks much cleaner in my opinion. Below this input field though, what I'd like to do is actually make a copy of this. So I'm going to select on this, hit Command C, select in my group and paste in another version. And in this case, I'd like to store the information about who the organizer of this event is. Now, the organizer of an event is not always going to be the person who created the event. In some cases, although a person is creating an event, they might be creating it on behalf of an organization that they work for. However, of course, if someone is putting on an event for themselves, they could just add their name into this field. But what we're going to do is first of all, update the title of this input field. I'm going to call this input event organizer. And then I'm also going to update the placeholder text within this field. So I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'll update the placeholder text to also display the word organizer. And because we've made a copy of this existing input field, we don't need to update any of the layout settings. All of that's already been taken care of. There is, however, just one last input field I'd like to add directly below this. And that's actually going to be a drop-down menu that allows someone to select what category this event should belong to. So if we scroll on down to our input forms, we're going to grab a drop-down input field. We'll add this into our white group. And the first thing we'll do is update the title of this to be called drop-down category. So that way we know that this is where we're going to select the relevant category for this event. Now, when it comes to this drop-down menu, what you'll see is you have two options of the types of information you can display within this menu. So you can display a list of static choices, which just means you can type in a list of all of the options that someone can select from, or you could select from a list of dynamic choices. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So by dynamic choices, that just means that it's going to pull a list of items from your database that already exists. Now, if you may remember, we created our list of categories as an option set. So that data already exists in our database. So if I was to jump to my dynamic choices here, I could select that for the data I'd like to display. I want to display a list of my categories from my option sets. When it comes to the types of option sets I want to show, I want to display all my categories. And for the actual value of the text that's displayed as an option, I'll reference the current option set, its display text, which is just the name of the option set. Then from here, I'm also just going to update the borders of this drop-down menu. I'd like it to have pointed edges, just like our input fields, not curved edges. So what I'm going to do is scroll on down to the style of this drop-down, and I'm actually going to edit the default style of this. And the reason for that is because I'm not creating just a one-off style. I want all of my drop-down menus to have pointed edges. So if I create this as a style, I can edit it once and then have that parlay across any other drop-down menu I use in the future. So I'm going to choose to edit the style here. And if I just head to my borders, I'm going to set the roundness of this to be 0. It's super straightforward. If I jump back to my design tab though, what I'll do is just jump to my layout tab. And to be honest, when it comes to the width and height of this dropdown, I'm going to leave these as the default settings. I'm quite happy with it being a fixed value at 250 pixels. So it will always be this size here, no larger and no smaller. And the same goes for the height. However, I would just like to add in 20 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left and also 30 on the right. So that way it sits in line with all of our existing elements in our overall white group. After adding this input field in though, I'd just like to add in yet another heading element. So we're going to break this group down into a different section once again. And in order to streamline the process of creating that heading, I'm just going to select on my first heading here. I'll make a copy of that and I'll move this down to the very last position within my white group. So within my layout tab, I can make this the last element. And when it comes to this heading, I'm just going to have this display the word location. So I'm going to update this here. I can see I just need to put a capital L at the start of that word. And the other thing I'd like to do is also update the icon that's displayed within this text element. Now, in this case, I'd like to display a map icon, in which if we wanted to find out what that map icon is called, I could head on up to my visual elements, just add an icon element anywhere on my page. It doesn't matter, I'm about to delete this, and just type in the word map. And now I'd like to use this map here, which I can see it's called map-o. So if I select on my actual text element and just remove this text from inside my brackets, I could just type in the word map-o. And what you'll see is that that's going to automatically format as a proper icon. I can then choose to delete this existing icon, and now my heading looks exactly how I want it to be. Below this heading though, what I'd like to do is add in yet another input field, which is going to allow a user to add in the location of this event. And so if I scroll on down to my input forms, I'm actually not going to use a regular input field. Similar to our homepage, what I'd like to do is use a search box, because I want this location field to integrate with Google Maps. So that way someone can select from a real world address or a real world location. So I'm going to add a search box into the bottom of my group here. And for this search box, I'm going to call this search box location. Now for the choices style here, if I'm going to be referencing real world addresses, I'm going to need to set this as a list of geographic places. And that will automatically integrate with any address in Google Maps. One thing I should point out though is that nothing in this world is free. So while you're experimenting and previewing your app, you might get an email from Bubble that says you've been rate limited for Google Maps. So essentially every single time you type an address into this field, Bubble's actually sending a request to Google Maps to validate that address, from which Google is then sending back a message to Bubble saying that that address exists and you can use it. Now, while you're actually getting started in Bubble, you'll often find that you can only make a handful of requests for free. So Bubble's going to cover the tab in that situation. But after a few searches, what you'll find is that you're going to need to source your own Google Maps API keys. Now, I know that might sound confusing, but it couldn't be easier. So what I want to do today is just point you in the right direction so you can make sure you sort that out now rather than later. So if you were to actually head up to the top of your Bubble editor, you'll see right here you have two existing issues within your app. And this is actually Bubble prompting you to get your own Google Maps API keys. So if we were to click on these, it's going to take you through to your settings page and open up your general tab. And if we were to scroll on down, what you'll see here under your general services API keys, Bubble's going to prompt you to add in 2 API keys for Google Maps. And what this means is that you'll be able to make as many API requests as you need within your own Google developer account. Now, when it comes to sourcing these API keys, you'll see that Bubble links out to their own documentation here. And not only do they have a written guide, which is pretty extensive in terms of telling you what API keys you need to enable and how to do that, but to simplify the whole process, they've also recorded a video tutorial with step-by-step instructions. So it'd be kind of pointless of me just recording the exact same tutorial twice. Although ironically, I do have a video on my channel that also explains how to do that. So between my video or Bubble's documentation video here, please just pause this existing course you're just watching now and take the time to grab your own API keys and add those into your application. The last thing I want you to do is slide into my DMs and tell me that your application doesn't work or you can't fetch locations or addresses, when 9 times out of 10, it's because you haven't set up your own API keys. So if you could take the time to do that now, it's going to save everyone the headache. If I was to jump back into Bubble though, I'm going to head to my design tab once again, and I'm just going to jump to my layout tab for this search box because I'm going to move this to the last position within my white group. Now, when it comes to this search box, I'd like this to be the same width as our existing input fields within our group. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width as 0. I'll set the maximum width to be 600 pixels. For the height, I'm quite happy to leave that fixed at 48 pixels because at this point, I don't need this search box to become any larger or smaller. This is the perfect size here. I will just need to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left and 30 on the right. And I could also just update the placeholder text for this search box to display something like venue location. So that way a user knows this is where they need to type in their location details. So if I jump to my appearance tab, under our placeholder text, I'm going to have this display the words venue location. And at this point in time, we're almost near the end of our first group. However, there's just one last section I'd like to add. And before we build out that section, I just want to make a copy of this heading again. So I'm going to select on this, make a copy of it. Then I will jump to my layout tab and move this to the last position within my group. And for this heading, I'm just going to update the text to display the words date and time. And when it comes to the icon before the text, I just like to display a little calendar. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm just going to add an icon anywhere on my page. I'll type in the word calendar. I want to use this calendar here. And I can see that the icon name is literally just called calendar. So if I jump back to the heading, I'm just going to remove the existing text between my brackets. And I'll just type in the word calendar. And that's automatically going to update. I can then just delete this icon here because I no longer need it. And then below this heading, I'd like to add a date time picker. So that way someone can select what date and time this event will occur. So if I scroll on down to my input fields, we're going to grab the date time picker input field. I'll add this on, and this is just going to be called date time picker. Honestly, I don't really need to give it any other name because it's pretty self-explanatory at this point what this input field is going to do. The one thing I would like to change is that I want to update this input type to not just be a date, but to be a date and a time. And what you'll now see is that this is going to split this into two different sections. So on the left-hand side, we have our date, and then on the right-hand side, we have our time. Now, I personally just like to set my time format in 12-hour time, not 24-hour time, and I'm happy with my time intervals as every 30 minutes. But of course, you can change that to whatever you would like. The only other thing I'd like to do is just update the style of this date time picker to have pointed edges, not curved edges. And once again, we're actually going to edit the default style because if I use a date time picker again at any point in my application, I'd also like it to have pointed edges. So I'm going to choose to edit the style of this here. Then I'm going to head to the borders and update the roundness of this to be 0. That's all I need to change here. I'll jump back to my design tab. And while we're here, I can also see I forgot to do the exact same thing on my search box above this. So what I'm going to quickly do is just divert and select on my search box, edit the default style of my standard search box. And I'm just going to update the roundness of its borders to be 0, so that way it also has pointed edges. But now we can jump back to my date time picker because I'd like to jump to my layout tab, move this to the last position within my white group. And when it comes to the dimensions of this element, I'm quite happy to leave these as the default settings, but I would just like to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left, and also 30 on the right. And just like that, that is all of the input fields we'll need to add into this particular group. The very last element we'll need to add at the bottom is going to be a button element. So I'm just going to scroll on up to my visual elements, grab a button, and add this at the bottom of my group. And this button's just going to display the word next. I don't need to make any changes to the styling because we're using the existing primary button style that we've already edited. I will, however, jump to my layout tab because in this instance, I'm going to update the width of this button to be 120 pixels. I'll leave that as a fixed width, so that way it's always going to be 120. And I'll also update the minimum height to be 40, so that way it just becomes slightly narrower. And then finally, I'm going to add in 30 pixels of margin around every single border for this button. And that's going to ensure it doesn't touch the borders of the actual group it sits within. And because that's the very last element I'd like to add into our first group, I'm now going to select on the group. So this is our group step 1. I'm going to then scroll on down to our height and set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around our button. The last thing I'd like to do though is just add in 30 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this group is not going to touch the borders of my overall page. Now, after building out this first group, what we're actually going to do is add yet another group onto our page, and that's going to be the second stage of the process where someone can actually create a new event in our Eventbrite clone. And in order to streamline the whole process of building out another group from scratch, what we're going to do is actually just make a copy of this existing group. So I'm going to select on this. Because I'm on a Mac, I'm going to hit Command C. Then I'm going to click on my page here and choose to paste in a new version of this. If I scroll on down, I can see that we have another version of this group. So it's now called Step 1 Copy. The first thing I'm going to do is actually update the title of this. So I'm going to call this group Step 2. And so essentially what's going to happen in our experience today is that when a user comes to this page, they're only going to see this first group here, and this second group will be hidden. And it's only at the point in time where a user selects this next button that we're then going to hide our first group and we'll display our second group. But I'll get to more on that in a moment. The first thing I'd like to do is actually build out all of the input fields that are going to be displayed in this second group. And within this group, it's going to include some of the more important details about an event. So things like the event images, the ticket price, the full description of the event, and a few other input fields. But the very first thing I'm going to do is head up to the top and update the first heading in this group. And when it comes to this heading, I'm going to have this display the words event, media, and of course, I'd like to update my icon element here again. And for this icon, I just like to display an icon of a little image or a picture. So in order to source the name of that, I'm going to grab an icon element, add it into my group. And if I was to just type in the word photo, I'd like to use this exact icon here. So I can see the name of this is file-photo-o. So I'm just going to copy the title there. I'll open up my text heading and just replace the existing icon text with the name of this icon, and of course that will update. And that's all I'll need to change for this heading. I'm then going to delete this text here. I no longer need that. And I'm also going to delete these 3 input fields because they're not relevant in this particular group. What I would like to do though is add in a picture uploader element that's going to allow a user to set a featured image for this event. So in order to do that, we're going to scroll on down to our input forms, and I'm going to grab a picture upload element. I'll add this below our heading. And for this picture uploader, the first thing I'll do is update the title of this. I'm going to call this picture uploader featured image. So that way when we build out the workflows, I know exactly which input field contains my featured image. And when it comes to this picture uploader, we'll jump to our layout tab because I'd like to update the width and responsive settings for this. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. And I'm going to set the minimum width here to be 0. But when it comes to the maximum width, I don't want it to be infinite because I don't want it to take up the entire width of my page. Instead, what I'm going to do is set the maximum width to be 500 pixels. So it will be no larger than this at its full size. I'm also then going to unselect that this should be a fixed height. And when it comes to the minimum height, I'm going to set this to be 250 pixels. So as you can see here, right now, this is currently a 2:1 ratio. So the width is twice as long as the height. And because the maximum height is set to infinite, if a picture is uploaded and it needs additional height, this element will expand down. Now, before I update any of the margins for this element, one thing I would actually like to do is add just a small heading above this input field, just to notify the user that this is where they should upload a featured image. So I'm actually going to go back and add a text element above here. And this is just going to display the words upload a featured image. I'm then going to choose to bold this text, and of course I'll need to make this fully responsive. So we'll jump to our layout tab, and like always, we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to 0, leave the maximum width as infinite, set the minimum height to 0, and then finally I'm going to add a top margin of 20, a left margin of 30, and a right margin of 30. Then if we were to click on our picture uploader element below this, I'm going to head to my layout tab and add a top margin of 10, a left margin of 30, and a right margin of 30. And that's all we'll need to change for this particular element. But from here, what I'd now like to focus on is a way in which a user can upload any additional images they want to display within the event page for this particular event. So the featured image is kind of like the thumbnail image that's going to be displayed for this event across our application. However, if someone is to click through to that event, we're also going to want to display a full list of any additional images that are relevant to this event. And so it's at this point in time, we're going to create that experience. Now, before we add in another input field, I'm just going to copy this small heading here and just drag this down to sit below our picture uploader. And for this heading, I'm just going to update the text that sits inside of this. I'm going to have this display the words upload additional images. And from here, we can add an input field below this, which will allow users to upload multiple images. And this is where we're going to run into a little bit of a dilemma. By default, under our input forms, we have a picture uploader element, which is the same element we just used above for our featured image. Now, one thing I should just point out is that this picture uploader only allows you to upload one image. So what's going to happen if we want to allow users to upload multiple images? And it's at this point in time that we're going to have to install a free plugin, which is going to empower that experience. So if we head to our plugins tab here, we're going to open up our plugins library, and we're just going to type in the word multi. Then we're going to install this free plugin, which is built by Bubble. So this is the multi-file uploader drop zone. I'll hit install. I'll then close my plugin library, jump to my design tab, And now under my input forms, you'll see this option to add in a multi-file uploader. So I'm going to add this below our second heading. And before I make any changes to this element, I'm just going to update the name of this to be called multi-file uploader images. Then from here, I can jump to my layout tab, because what I'd like to do is update the dimensions of this input field. Now, I should also point out that this input field isn't actually going to show a preview of any images inside the input. We're going to need to build out a separate repeating group which will do that. But instead, I just wanted to highlight that this input field is only going to display the file names that have been uploaded into it. So it doesn't actually really need to take up too much space on our page. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, head to my layout tab and unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, but I'm going to leave a maximum width of 300 pixels. So that means at its largest possible size, this input field will be no wider than this. I'm also going to unselect that this should be a fixed height, and I'll set the minimum height to be 150. So once again, you can see that this is a 2:1 aspect ratio because our width is twice as long as the height. Now, if I leave the maximum height as infinite, it will also allow this element to expand down if it needs to display more file names, but I'm quite happy with that for the meantime. I'm going to then add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left and 30 on the right. And as I mentioned, we're also going to need to create an experience that allows us to actually show a preview of all of the files that have been uploaded into this input. And of course, what's the best way to show a list of items? It is by using a repeating group. And before we add this repeating group onto our page, I'm actually going to add a group so our repeating group can sit inside of that group. Now I know that might seem confusing, but there are benefits to using groups when you're hiding and displaying items. And I'm going to show you why that's the case in a moment. So what we're going to do is head to our containers menu and just grab a group element. We'll drag this below our multi-file uploader. And perhaps what I should also do is add a border around our multi-file uploader, just so I can see where it actually sits on our page. So I'll quickly just divert and click on that. Then I can jump to our appearance tab. And if I just scroll on down to the border, I'll just set this to be solid. And now I can see where that sits if I was to click away. I'll then click on my new group I've added onto the page. And I'm going to call this group images. Or perhaps I could even call this group image preview, because this is the group that's going to display the preview of all of our images that were uploaded into our multi-file uploader here. I'm then going to choose to detach the style so I can update the background style to be a flat color. I'll set this to be a light shade of red, so that way while we're building our app, I can see where this actually sits on our page. Then I'll jump to our layout tab because I'd like to make this group fully responsive. For the container layout, I'm only going to add one element into this group, and that element will be a repeating group. So it doesn't really matter if I select from a row or a column. I'll just select a column. Then for the width of this element, I of course will unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. And now I can start to add my repeating group into this red group. And thankfully, this repeating group is going to be fairly straightforward to set up. So if we head to our containers menu, I'm going to add a repeating group into my red group. And like all repeating groups, the first thing we'll need to do is give it a data source so it knows which data or which list of things it should display. So we'll jump to our appearance tab. For the type of content here, I'd like to display a list of images. So I'm not going to reference a data type in my database. Instead, I'm going to scroll on down and you'll see the option to display a list of images. Then for the data source, this is super straightforward. I just want to display all of the images that have been uploaded into this multi-file uploader. So I can set the data source to be the multi-file uploader. In fact, I could just type in the word multi and I could select from the uploader its value. That is all we'll need to change. I'm then going to unselect that there should be a fixed number of rows and a fixed number of columns, because I want this repeating group to show as many or as little images as the user has uploaded, so it won't be a fixed number. Now, while we're working on our repeating group, I'm just going to set the height of each row and the width of each column here to be 300 pixels. And of course, I'll most likely come back and change that in a moment once I figure out the perfect dimensions. But for now, I'll also jump over to my layout tab and update the responsive settings of this repeating group. Before I update the width, of course, I'll need to give this a container layout. Now, within each repeating group cell, I'm once again only going to be displaying one item. So it doesn't really matter if I select between a row or a column. I'm more of a column guy myself, so I'm going to select that. And from here, I'm going to then unselect that this repeating group should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And we'll come back and update the height settings in a moment. From here though, what we can do is actually display the image preview inside of our repeating group cell. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, we're going to grab an image element and we'll add that into our repeating group cell. Now for the dynamic image source of this photo, it's going to be super straightforward. We're just going to insert dynamic data and reference the current cell's image. So that is the image that's been uploaded into our multi-file uploader, which is of course the data source for our repeating group. Now, when I work with dynamic images, as I've mentioned in the past, I always like to select this more option so I can choose to process this image with ImgX, and that way I can select to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them, so the image will scale out and take up as much space as it needs. I'm then going to choose to detach the style of this image, because while I'm working on this image, I'd like to give it some solid borders so I can see where it actually sits in my repeating group, and that is all I'll need to change here. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab because I'll need to make this image fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, and I am going to leave the maximum width as infinite. So that way this image can take up as little or as much space as it needs inside of my repeating group cell. What I will do though is also select to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed, and I'm going to set that at a 2:1 ratio, so that way it becomes a perfect rectangle. And it's at this point that you can start to see my image coming together quite nicely. But of course the image is actually hugging the borders of my repeating group. So I'm also going to add in 10 pixels of margin around every single border for this image. And now you'll see it has a nice amount of space between each repeating group cell. And look, because that is the only element we'll need to add into our repeating group cell, we can now select on our repeating group. So this is our repeating group image, and we're going to remove all of this empty space that we don't need at the bottom. So under our layout tab, we're going to head to the minimum height and set this to be 0. Now that has removed some of the empty space, but we'll need to remember that in our appearance tab, I had set the minimum height of each row to be 300 pixels. If I was to now set this to be 0, what you'll see is that this repeating group is going to collapse perfectly around the image inside of it. Now, when it comes to the width of the column that we need to select, before we determine the exact value we need, we should first of all make some final changes to the red group that this repeating group is going to sit within. And so if I was to click on the red group, so this is our group image preview, I'm going to jump to our layout tab, and I'm first of all going to head on down to the minimum height, and I'm going to set that to be 0. And of course what you'll see is that that is now going to collapse nicely around our repeating group that sits inside of it. Then from here, I'd also like to add a top margin of 20 pixels, a left margin of 20 pixels, and a right margin of 20 pixels. And the reason why I wanted to touch base on this first is because if we're adding 20 pixels of margin on each side of this group, that's going to influence how much width we need for each cell of our repeating group. So if you remember, at the smallest possible device size on a mobile of 320 pixels, we're just going to need to subtract 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 on the right. So 320 take 20 is going to be 280. So if I now select on my repeating group, head to my appearance tab, and now update the minimum width of each column to be 280 pixels. That's going to allow, at the smallest possible size, one cell of our repeating group to be displayed. And of course, these will all stack on top of each other quite nicely, so they're going to be fully responsive. Now, while we're working on this repeating group and the red group that it sits within, we're also going to need to create a condition that only displays this red group once a user has taken the time to upload images to this multi-file uploader. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is select on my repeating group, then I'm going to right click on this and select its first parent. So the first parent is the red group that our repeating group sits within. And if we were to jump over to our layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. I'm also going to choose to collapse this element when it's hidden, and then you'll see this additional option to animate the collapse operation. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to leave this as the slide up / down animation style. And so now this is why I wanted to add our repeating group into this red group. When groups are hidden and collapsed, you have the option to actually animate that operation. So it just creates a much better end user experience. But of course, we just need to remember that by default now, this group and its images are not being displayed. So we're going to have to create a condition that's going to recognize when this group should in fact be shown to the user. So if we head to our conditional tab, we're going to define a condition, and we're just going to recognize when the multi-file uploader, so this is our file uploader here, where someone's going to add all of the images. When the value of this So the value is any images that have been uploaded into it. And when the count of how many images that have been uploaded is greater than, and I'm just going to type in the number 0, I'd like to select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. So now by default, this group will not be shown, but the second someone uploads at least one image into this file uploader, this repeating group is going to be displayed with all of the images inside of it. And look, I know that seemed like a lot of work to create just one small feature, but trust me, it's going to create a much better end user experience for any of your users in your app. Moving down our list though, the next thing I'd like to do is allow someone to add in a description for this event. So what I'm going to do is once again update this next title here. So where our heading displays the word location, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm going to have this display the word summary. I can see there's just a small typo there, so I'll fix that. And when it comes to the icon, if I want to find the correct icon name, I could just select on my little picture icon here. And I'm just looking for a text icon. I might use this one here, which is known as our text width. So I'm just going to copy the title of this. I'll then select on my heading element, remove the existing icon name in my HTML formatting, and just paste in the new icon. Then below this heading, before I add in an input field, I'd just like to add almost like another text summary, which just prompts someone as to what they need to type into this input field. And in order to streamline that process, I could actually scroll right on up to the very first group, and I could just copy this existing text element here because it's the exact same style that I want to use. So I'm going to copy that. I'll head on down to my second group, select in here and paste that in. And I can see it's been pasted to the top of the group. So I'll just need to drag this down below my heading element. And when it comes to the text inside of this, I'm going to delete all of our existing text. I'm just going to paste in another short sentence. And if you want to know what this sentence says, it just displays the words, grab people's attention with a short description about your event. Attendees will see this at the top of your event page. And now look, I just copied this from the real world Eventbrite product. So if you wanted that, you could either pause the tutorial and write it down now, or you could go to Eventbrite and you could just copy it yourself. Below this text though, I'm going to add in an input field, which will allow someone to write a short summary for this event. So I'm going to head on down to my input forms, and I'm not going to grab just a standard input field. Instead, I'm going to grab a multi-line input field because I'm going to allow someone to add in perhaps more than one sentence. And so I'm going to add this below my text element, and I'm going to call this element my multi-line input description summary. Then from here, I can jump to my layout tab because of course I'll need to make this element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I will set the minimum width to be 0, but I will set the maximum width to be 600 pixels. So that way it sits in line with any of the existing input fields that were also 600 pixels in max width. And for the height, I'm going to set the minimum height to be 48 pixels. But of course, because this is a multi-line input field, I'm going to leave the maximum height as infinite here. So that way, if a user needs to type in more than one line of text, it will continually expand downwards. And finally, before I wrap up with this input field, I'm going to add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left, and also 30 on the right. Now below this input field, I'd like to pretty much copy these three elements and replicate the exact same experience. Only this time, I'm going to prompt a user to add in the full description of this event. So this is going to be quite a long text field. So I'm actually going to select my heading, my text element, and my input field, and I'm going to make a copy of all these three elements. I'll then just need to rearrange these so they sit within the same order as before. So it goes heading, text, input. Then I'm going to start by selecting on my heading, and I'm just going to update the text in this to display the word description. Once again, I can see I have a small typo there, so I'm just going to fix that. And look, to be honest, I'm quite happy to leave the icon as is. I don't need to change that for this particular heading. What I would like to change though is the text that's displayed within this small display text here. So I'm going to select this, delete all the existing text, and I'm going to paste in another short sentence here. If you'd like to know what this sentence says, it displays the words, write a full description about your event. Share what attendees can expect on the day. It's super straightforward. Of course, if you wanted to change this and write whatever you would like, feel free to do that now. But the only other thing I'd like to do is select on the multi-line input field here we've copied across. And I'm just going to update the name of this to be called multi-line input full description. So that way I can easily differentiate between both of these input fields. What I also might do is jump to my layout tab. And I might update the maximum width of this multi-line input field to be something like 800. And now the reason for that is because that's just going to prompt a user to see that they can add in more text into this field. Because of course this is where they're going to add that full description. But now because this input field has a minimum width of 0, it's going to be completely responsive, just like the existing multi-line input field that sits above it. So we don't need to change anything else there. Thankfully, that's all I'll need to change for this input field. So we're going to keep heading on down through our page. I'm going to select on this search box here. I don't need this anymore, so I'm going to delete that. I'll keep our icon purely because I just need to find the name of another icon in a moment. I'm going to select on our next heading here though. I'm going to jump to our appearance tab and I'm just going to update this to display the word price. I'd also like to update the icon that's displayed beside this. So I'm going to head to my icon, open up my icon library, and I'm just going to type in the word ticket. I can see there's a little ticket icon, which the name of this is literally just ticket. So if I open up my heading, just delete the word calendar, I can replace this with the word ticket, and that will update. I'll also then delete my date time picker. I don't need that. Instead, what I'd like is an input field that's going to allow someone to add in a currency. So if I head to my input forms, we're going to grab a regular input field here. I will add this below our heading. And the first thing we're going to do is update the title of this to be called input price. And when it comes to this input field, we're going to need to update the content format here. And that is because at this point in time, the content format is set to text. So this is only going to display a text value. Whereas what I'd like to do is open up the drop-down menu and select to display a currency. Then I can select my currency prefix to be dollars. If you want to set this to be anything else, feel free to do that now. But what this means is that it's going to now store the value of this input as a number. And it's going to actually format that to look like a currency, which is the exact experience we want to create. The only other thing we'll need to do is, of course, make this element fully responsive. So if we jump to our layout tab, I'm sure you're probably sick of me saying this by now, but we're going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0. I'm actually going to set a maximum width of 300 pixels to this input because I don't want it to actually be any wider than this size here. I will keep the height fixed at 48 because it's perfect the way it is. I will add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the left and also 30 on the right. And then finally, there is one very last input field I'd like to add into our second group. And in order to streamline the process of creating that, I'm going to select both my heading and my input field. I'll make a copy of that and paste in another version. I'll then just need to reshuffle these. And then I'm going to jump to my appearance tab for my heading. I'll update this to display the words available quantity. And I'll also update the icon here. I'm going to select on my small icon, open up my library and just type in the word user. And the icon I'd like to select is this one here, which is known as icon users. I'll then jump to my heading once again, replace the word ticket with the word users. That of course will update and format nicely. And look, I no longer need this small icon, so I'm going to delete that. And then finally, we'll just need to head to the quantity input field and we're going to need to update the name of this to be called input quantity. I can see I've just added 2 dashes there. I'll quickly fix that. And when it comes to the content format here, I actually want to set this to be a number, which in Bubble is known as an integer. So now this means someone will be able to add only numbers into this input field. And look, thankfully, that is the very last input field we need to add into this group. And this is the last group we'll need to add onto this page. There are still just a few minor things we need to take care of before we wrap up this module. And the first thing I want to do is just update the word that's displayed within this button. So I'm going to update this from the word next to the word publish. And before we go and build out the workflow that's actually going to create a new event whenever this button is clicked, what I want to do is create the workflows that's going to either hide or display the relevant group on this page. So as I mentioned, when a user lands on this page, I only want this first group to be visible. And it's after they've finished adding in all of the details for these input fields and they select this next button that I'm going to hide this group and then display our second group. So it kind of breaks this whole experience into 2 different steps. And in order to create some sort of way to reference which group we should show and which group we should hide, we're going to leverage what's known as a custom state in Bubble. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, custom states can definitely be a little bit overwhelming. So I'm going to be sure to explain everything in as simple terms as possible. But essentially, custom states are kind of like a data field that sits on your page. So instead of having to reference data stored in your database, you can just temporarily store a value in your page, and it just saves you from actually having to store data in your database that you don't need to store. Because if you start to store unnecessary data, it's going to slow your application down. So if I was to click on my overall page, so this gray element here, which is known as the create, because this is my create page. What you'll see is this little information icon that's going to open up this little backdoor menu known as your element inspector. And within this, you'll see that we have the ability to create a new custom state. Now, when I click this, it's going to look identical to the process of actually creating a data field in your database. And that is because we are essentially creating a data field on our page. And at any point in time, we can choose to store and reference data in our page without having to write it or pull it from our database. Now today, I'm actually going to create two separate custom states. The first one is going to be called display step 1. And I'm going to set this state type to be a yes/no value. So I either do want to display step 1, which is our first group, or I won't want to. So I'm going to choose to create this. Now what I'm also going to do is set the default value of this to be yes. So by default, I would like to display step 1 of this whole experience, which is going to be our group number 1. I'd also like to create another custom state, and I'm going to call this display step 2. Once again, this will be a yes/no type. I'll create this. Only this time, I'd like to set the default value of this to be no, because I won't want to display the second group by default. I'm only going to want to display it whenever someone clicks this button here. And so as soon as this page is loaded, we've already got a little bit of data stored in our page. So we're currently storing the information which says that we need to display group 1, or I should say step 1. And then we're also storing some information which says we should not display step 2. And based on the value we're storing in our custom state across our page, we can create conditions on each of these groups and have these behave in a certain way, so that way they can reflect the states here. And so if I was to close this element inspector and select on my group step 1, what I'm actually going to do is head to my layout tab, and I'm going to unselect that this element should be visible on page load. And I'm also going to tick to collapse this element when it's hidden. So now by default, this group will be invisible as soon as the page is loaded. However, if I was to jump to my conditional tab, I can define a condition, and I can just recognize when that display step 1 custom state is yes, which it is by default. I'd like this group to be visible on the page. So what I'm going to do is select from our overall create page. So if I scroll on down to the very bottom, you'll see the option to reference our create page. And now at the bottom of this, you'll see the option to reference the custom states stored in that page. So I'm going to reference the display step 1 custom state. And when the value for this is in fact yes, which of course it is by default, what I'm going to do is select that this element should be visible, and I'm going to tick that that should be true. Then what we're going to do is head on down to our second group. So this is our group step 2. Once again, we're going to jump to our layout tab. We're going to unselect that this group should be visible on page load, which now means it's going to be hidden. We'll also choose to collapse this group when it's hidden. And from here, we can jump to our conditional tab and define a new condition. And we're just going to recognize when, once again, the create page. So if we scroll on down to the bottom, you'll see the option to reference the create. And when the display step 2 custom state is in fact yes, which it is not by default. It's only going to be yes when we change it in a moment. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. Now, as I just mentioned, by default, our display step 1 custom state is set to yes, but we're going to need a way to change the display step 2 custom state to yes, and then turn off the display step 1 custom state. So what we can do is create a workflow whenever this next button is clicked. So I'm going to click on this, head to our appearance tab, and then choose to start a new workflow. And within this workflow, I'm just going to type in the word state, and I'm going to select to set the state of an element. The element in this case is going to be our overall create page. And the first custom state I'm going to set is the display step 1. Now, because this is already set to yes by default, what I'd like to do is set this to now be no. I'm also then going to need to update the display step 2 custom state. And because that is currently no, I'm going to want to switch that through to be yes. And now that is how we can toggle between both of these custom states. And of course, both of our groups are going to reflect the information stored on our page. And after building out this workflow, there is just one very last thing we'll need to do for this whole experience of creating an event. And that is that we need to build out the workflow that's actually going to create an event inside of our database. So if we were to jump back to our design tab here, and if we scroll on down to our step 2 group, at the very bottom of this, we have a button element which displays the word publish. Now, after someone's finished adding in all of the details for their event, they're going to click this button and we're going to need to create an event in our database. So what we're going to do is choose to start a new workflow when this button is clicked. Now, within this workflow, we're going to need to do a couple of different things. And one thing I should reiterate on before we actually build out the different steps in this workflow is how we've structured the details of an event within our database. So if we were to head to our data tab in our database, you might remember that we have 2 separate data types for our event. First of all, there's our overall event data type. So this contains all of the top level information about this event. So things like the category, the date, time, the description, and so on. But when it came to our larger data fields, so information that was going to store quite a bit of content, so things like our long form description as well as the images that are going to be uploaded to an event, we'd broken this down into our event details data type. So this was a separate data type. So when we go to create an event in our database, we not only need to create an event, but we also need to create some event details, and we need to link these event details to our main event data type. Because if you remember, we have a data field in our event known as the full details, and this links to our separate event details data type. So what we'll need to do in our workflow first is actually create the event details, then create an event, and then create that link between the two. And of course, I'm going to be sure to walk you through every single step throughout the process. So if we jump back into our workflow tab, we're going to select to add a new action. And if we head to our data tab, we're going to choose to create a new thing. And the type of thing we're going to first create, as I mentioned, is the event details. Now, all we'll need to do is match the relevant data fields under our event details to the relevant fields on our page. So I'm going to select to add all the fields here. When it comes to the description, this is going to be relatively straightforward. We just need to link this to our multi-line input full description. Then when it comes to our images, what we'll need to do is store a list of images that have been uploaded in our multi-file uploader. So what I'm going to do is choose to set this list, and I'm going to set this list to be the value of the multi-file uploader, its images. It's as straightforward as that. Now, once we've finished creating our event details, we're going to add an additional step into our workflow. We're going to head to our data tab, and we're going to choose to create another new thing. Only this time, the thing we'll be creating is an overall event. Once again, I'll select to add all of the fields here, and then we'll need to match all of the relevant data fields with the relevant input fields on our page. So let's walk through this list together. So on the category, this is going to equal the value of the drop-down category. For the date time, this will equal the value of our date time picker. For the description summary, I'm just going to type in the word multi, and I'll reference the value stored within our multi-line input description summary. And this is where you can really start to see those naming conventions coming into play. It makes it super straightforward to actually just search for the particular input field you're looking for. And it's just going to save you a ton of time throughout the building process. For the featured image, I'm just going to type in the word picture, because I'm going to select from the picture uploader featured image its value. Now for the full details, this is where we're going to need to create a link to our initial data type here, which is our event details. And thankfully, this is a super straightforward process. All we need to do is link this to the result of step 1 in our workflow. Because in step 1 in our workflow, we created some new event details. So now we're just telling Bubble that, hey, these are the event details that should be linked to this particular event. That's all you need to do. For the location, I'm going to scroll on down and select from the search box location, which is right at the bottom here, its value. For the organizer, I'll type in the word organize, and I'll select from the input event organizer. For the price, I'll type in the word price and select the input price. For the tickets available, I'm going to type in the word quantity, because this was the field that was related to how many tickets are going to be available for purchase. I'll select its value. Then for the tickets sold, we actually don't need to change this field here because of course at this point in time, no tickets have been sold. So I'm going to choose to delete this field. For the title, I'll just type in the word title and reference the input title, its value. And then finally for the total view count, I also don't need this right now. So I'm going to choose to delete this here. And just like that, we would have a brand new event created in our database. But there's one last thing I want to do in this workflow, and that is just redirect a user through to a page where they can manage a list of all of the events that they've published within our platform. And so what I'm going to do is add an additional step into my workflow here. I'm going to head to the navigation events and select the go to page action. And at this point in time, I want to send a user through to our manage page. And I should just highlight that at this point in time, this page is blank. We haven't added anything to it, but I just want to send someone through to this page because we're about to build this out in a future module in our tutorial. But after adding this step into our workflow, that actually wraps up everything I wanted to cover within this module in our series today. What I'd love to do is just run a preview of this application and show you what the whole process looks like in creating an event from scratch. Over in a preview of my create page here, what you'll first notice is that our first group is being displayed. So this is our group step 1, and our group step 2 is currently not visible. And that is because the custom state to display that has not yet been activated. What I'm going to do is just move my head out of the way here, and then I can work my way through the list of input fields that I need to set when it comes to creating a new event. So what I'm going to do is create an event, and I'm going to call this no code conference. For the organizer, I'm going to say that this is building with Bubble. So it's not I, Lachlan Kirkwood, creating this event. It is building with Bubble, who's going to be putting this on. For the category, I'm going to select that this will fit into the business category. Then for the location, I'm just going to add in an address within my own city. And finally for the date time, I'm just going to pick any date in the future here, as well as a time. Let's say it starts at 9:30 a.m. And now I can select next. It's going to hide my first group, now display my second group. And it's from here that I can upload a featured image from my event. So I'm just going to grab an image from my local device here. And look, to be honest, I'm just using an image that I've just grabbed off Google. Then for the additional images, I can select in my multi-file uploader, or I could drag a series of images into this. If I click in this field though, and just upload a few images from my local device, what you'll see is that these images will upload. And then because the count of images within our multi-file uploader is greater than 0, our red group is now going to display. And of course, it's going to show our repeating group of images here. Now, these are just a series of sample images I've grabbed. By all means, they're not related to my event at all, but you get the idea. This is what our preview is going to look like to end users. I'm then going to scroll on down to the summary here. And if I didn't want to type in a summary of my own from scratch, I could just grab some dummy text to fill this in. So I'm just going to go to lipsum.com, which is where you can grab lorem ipsum text from. I'm then just going to grab this string of text here. This will do. I'll jump into my application, paste that in, and I'll just restructure that there. I might also just remove the first quotation mark, and then I'll also need to grab some text for our full description. So I'm just going to grab this full paragraph here. I'll copy this. I'll then jump back into the preview of my application, paste that into my description field. And of course, because this is a multi-line input field, it's going to continually just expand down and fit all of this text in. When it comes to the price of this event, I'm going to set tickets at $99. And for the available quantity, let's say I can support up to 1,000 people at this event. Perfect. So that is everything I'll need to add for the details of this event. At this point in time, I'm quite happy with what I've added, and I'd just like to publish this event. So what I'm going to do is click this button here. That workflow is going to run, and it's not only going to create an event within our database, but it's now going to redirect us through to our manage page, as you can see within our URL string. And of course, as I mentioned before, this page is currently blank. We haven't yet built it out. So there should be nothing on it at this point in time. But if we were to jump back into our Bubble editor and open up our data tab here, we could head over to the app data menu, open up all our events, and I can now see that we have a new event created in our database here. And of course, if you wanted to run a preview of your homepage, and if you properly configured your own Google Maps API keys, you would now see this event if it's near your own location. So this is where you can really start to see our Eventbrite clone come to life. After building out this feature though, I'd just like to jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the feature to create and publish events. And look, there was quite a bit involved within this process, particularly when it came down to creating the custom states to either hide and display certain groups. But at this point in time, things are going to get much easier from here. Thankfully, we've really taken care of a lot of the heavy lifting in our overall build today. And unfortunately, that is all I have time to include within this video today. As you can see, we've been building for hours and there's still so many features that I need to cover in as much detail as I possibly can. If you are interested in finishing your Eventbrite clone, I'd always recommend hitting the link in the description of this video so that way you can grab the full course from my website. Now, while this full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of your life having to learn how to rebuild each of these features from scratch. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you want to launch your app as quickly as possible. Throughout that full course, it's going to explain how we can build all of the remaining features within our app today. And that's going to include things like being able to register user accounts, how event hosts can manage a full list of all of the events that they publish, how they can edit the details of events, how they can view analytics for each event, how we can build a dynamic event page to display the full details of those events, how we can process payments, how we can display a list of all of someone's purchased tickets, how to build a custom search feature as well as a search results page, and then finally how we can also build out a dynamic user profile page to display the details of each event host. Look, I really wasn't lying when I said there's still so much that we need to cover within this course. In the meantime, if you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. For now though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.